The most plausible story of all is sort of the humans give the AIs everything they need story. The AIs just chill, they make sure they have control of the situation, maybe they're manipulating what's going on, they're sabotaging the alignment experiments, they're sabotaging the alignment results, they're deluding us, but they don't do anything very aggressive. They're just chilling, they do lots of good stuff, there's cures to all diseases, or like all kinds of great stuff is happening, industrial development. People are like, well, it's so great that, AI did go well and we didn't have misalignment. Like it could be potentially that humans are deluded indefinitely, right? It might be just like you can in principle Potemkin village the entire way through. And then I think another story is sort of like I would call like sudden robot coup, which is like, this also doesn't require very superhuman capabilities, which is like we build vast autonomous robot armies and we're like, hooray, we're building a vast robot army to compete with China. And China's like, hooray, we're building a vast robot army to compete with the US. Truly, it's great that we have such a big robot army. And then it's like, oh, whoops, all of a sudden the robot armies like sweep in and do a relatively hard power takeover. I think a mistake that the safety community appears to have made, too much focus on overly optimistic worlds. Actually focusing on desperate, crazy, YOLO'd, pessimistic worlds is like pretty reasonable because that's where a lot of the risk lives.
Today, I have the pleasure of speaking with Ryan Greenblatt. Ryan is the chief scientist at Redwood Research and the lead author on the paper Alignment Faking in Large Language Models, which has been described as probably the most important empirical result ever on the topic of loss of control of artificial intelligence. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Ryan.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
Let's start by talking about the best arguments for and against software-based intelligence explosion in the relatively near future, by which I guess I'm thinking maybe under 4 years approximately. Yeah, what do you think is the chance that we'll be able to largely automate AI R&D or maybe roughly automate a full AI company as it exists today within the next 4 years or so?
Yeah, I think the probability of sort of that capability existing, not necessarily being used, not necessarily being fully deployed, I'd say is about 25%. And then maybe about 50% if we extend to like 8 years.
Yeah. I think many people hear that and they would wonder, is this just pure speculation? How can we form realistic or grounded expectations about this kind of thing? I'd be interested to know what are kind of the key pieces of evidence that bear on you making a prediction or forecast like that. I mean, maybe what is a key piece of evidence that makes you think it is plausible at all?
Yeah. So, to start, I think a good place to look is be okay, what are the current level of AI capabilities? How close does it feel? And now people have obviously wildly different intuitions about how close we are in some objective sense. So I think currently the situation is sort of the AIs are getting better and better at math, and they're sort of marching through the human regime in math. They're sort of able to do, I would say, roughly maybe about 1 hour, 1.5 hour sort of isolated software engineering tasks. By that, I mean a task that would take a human roughly an hour or an hour and a half. And they're sort of getting better at a variety of different skills. So I think we're sort of at a pretty objectively impressive regime, and importantly, a much more objectively impressive regime than we were at 2 years ago, and certainly much more impressive than we were 4 years ago. So I think a naive starting point for where will we be in 4 years is, well, where were we 4 years ago? Where are we now? Trying to qualitatively extrapolate from here to there. Now, this is a bit of a sloppy perspective. So I think a bunch of people sort of had maybe what I would have said 2 years ago would have been, well, we had GPT-3, now we have GPT-4. What's the gap there? Let's sort of sloppily extrapolate that forward and get a sense from there. Now, I think now we can do better because we have GPT-3, we have GPT 3.5, we have GPT-4. We've had sort of the progression since GPT-4 and roughly the 2 years since then. So over that period, we've sort of gone from the AIs just barely being able to do agentic tasks to having some reasonable amount of ability to succeed at that, some ability to recover from mistakes. So sort of over this period, it was sort of I think GPT-4 was maybe it could complete some tasks that would take humans 5 or 10 minutes on agentic tasks. It could sort of understand how to use the tools. I think GPT 3.5 basically couldn't even understand sort of the tools in agentic scaffolds. GPT-4 could understand these things. And then over that period, we've sort of gone from can understand the tools, can maybe do it some of the time, to can do tasks that take a human software engineer an hour and a half, 50% of the time. And there's sort of a trend line of how fast we've been marching through that regime. And over 2024, at least, it's been pretty fast progress, starting from basically nothing at all to hour and a half, with doubling times of I'm stealing a bunch of content from Meter, which I think maybe there'll be a podcast with Beth before this that comes out, or maybe comes out someone after this, which covers a bunch of the same content. But we've sort of seen doubling times that are fast enough that we'd expect the AIs doing 8-hour tasks or 16-hour tasks I guess my view would be like on that trend line, it's like in maybe a little less than 2 years, which is, pretty fast progress. And then, from there, it's like if you're into the regime where they're doing week-long tasks, I think you can maybe get pretty close to automating the job of a research engineer with some schlep on top of that.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got, I guess you would say that objectively they're pretty impressive in what they can do right now. I mean, I guess some people have a more skeptical reaction to that. Is there anything that you could point to say, to be I guess, clearer about what they're able to do and what they're not able to do, and maybe answer people who would say, sometimes I use these tools and they seem very stupid, or they don't seem able to do things that I would expect them to be able to do, or they produce a whole lot of reasoning and I find errors in it?
Yeah. So I'd say like my kind of like qualitative vibesy model is like the AIs, they're pretty dumb. They used to be much dumber. They're getting smarter quickly. And they're very knowledgeable. So I think a lot of what people are interfacing with is sort of, we've got these systems that are like, they've got some smarts to them. They can really like figure out some pretty general situations, okay. And especially with like, reasoning models, they're like pretty good at like thinking through some stuff. Now, in addition to that, they're very knowledgeable, which means that there's sort of a misleading impression of how sort of like overall general and how adaptable they are that people notice. And this is a lot of what people are reacting to. So there's like sort of a over-optimistic perspective, which I would say, I think is like sort of characterized by this like chart Leopold had, where he's like PhD level intelligence, or like people are like PhD level intelligence. And then, some people respond to that being like a PhD level intelligence. I mean, like, come on, I can't play tic-tac-toe. Or I mean, maybe that's no longer true with reasoning models, but like directionally, like, it can't play tic-tac-toe. It can't, respond to relatively novel circumstances. It gets tripped up by this stuff. Now, I think we have to, discount some of it's getting tripped up by this stuff, because I think a bunch of these things might be sort of more well described as like cognitive biases than lack of smarts. So, like humans, there's a bunch of things that humans sort of systematically get wrong, even though they're pretty stupid. So an example, or like, in some sense, they're pretty dumb errors. So there's sort of like, I forget the name of this, but like, the conjunction fallacy or something, where if you're like, what is the chance that someone is a librarian? What is the chance they're a librarian and some property librarians have? I think often people, I might be getting this a bit wrong, but they're more likely on the conjunction of the two, even though, that
has to be less likely.
And I think AI systems sort of have biases that are sort of like this, that are sort of shaped by the environment in which they were created or by their training data. So as an example, like if you give AIs like a riddle, like there's a man and a boat and a goat, the boat can carry two things, or it can carry, the man and one other item. How many trips does it take for them to cross the river? Well, okay, the answer is, one trip. They can just cross the river.
Right.
But there's, a similar riddle, which is like involving like, a man, a goat, a wolf,
brain or
and
something,
like a cabbage, or, and there's some tricky approach. And the AIs they're so reflexively used to doing this that maybe they immediately sort of blurt out an answer. But they can, and they sort of have a strong heuristic towards that answer, but it might just be more the sort of like they're like feel a nudging to that. But sort of if you sort of get them to be like, oh, it's a trick question, then they go from that. And in fact, you can get humans on the same sort of trick questions, right?
Sure.
So if you ask humans like, what's heavier, a pound of bricks or a pound of feathers, they'll be like, oh, the bricks, and they get tripped. And then it's like the language models sort of have the exact opposite problem, where if you ask them, what's heavier, 2 pounds of bricks or a pound of feathers, they're like, oh, same weight. And so I think I worry that a lot of the sort of like the tricks people are doing are sort of like analogous to tricks you could execute on humans, and it's hard to know how much to draw from that.
Yeah, I guess a general challenge here assessing how capable they are is that I think Nathan Lebenz uses this expression that they're human level but not human-like. So like overall, maybe they're similarly capable as human employees in some situations, but they have very different strengths and weaknesses. They can be tripped up in ways that seem completely baffling to us. But I guess you can imagine an AI society that would look at humans and say, how is it that they can't multiply in their heads, 2, 3-digit numbers? That seems crazy.
Yeah.
Like these are obviously not general intelligences, or they have almost no memory of this book that they read last week. That doesn't make any sense. How could an intelligence act that way? So it makes it a little bit hard to, I guess, have a common ground on which to compare humans versus AIs. Yeah, is there more to say on how you would assess what level they're at now?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say like I think that I wouldn't use the term human level. So I generally would maybe this is me being a little bit of a conservative, or me being maybe a bit pedantic, but I think I like reserving the term for human level at like can automate like a substantial fraction of cognitive jobs. So I'd be like, maybe I'd be like, well, we're starting to get into like the humanish level AIs once we're like, it's really automated. It can really just like fully automate away a bunch of human jobs, or sort of like be a part of the cognitive economy in a way that is comparable to humans. And maybe not, full automation at that point, but I also like talking about the full automation point. So that's one thing on just responding to that. More context on how good the AIs are. Yeah, so I think I'm like, so some things we're seeing that are maybe somewhat relevant. So we're sort of seeing AIs sort of march through how good they are at math and competitive programming. So, we've seen going from over 2024 from basically like the AIs doing, I think, being like bottom 20th percentile or something roughly on code forces to being currently in the top 50, I think, according to what Sam Altman said.
And top 50 individuals?
Top 50 individuals,
Yeah,
like literally
right,
the top 50 people,
Yeah.
Or at least people who do code forces. Maybe there's, some people who aren't on the leaderboard, but roughly speaking, and then it looks like I think we'll get basically better than the best human at that specific thing before the end of the year. And then, on math, currently we're more like, I think the AIs are sort of like, I would say at the level of a, maybe like, this is based on an anecdote from a colleague, but like maybe they're at the level of like a very competitive 8th grader or something on short numerical, but competition math problems like AME. They're like, like a very like I think like the top 8th graders are doing as well as the AIs are doing right now. And the AIs are, I think, a decent amount worse on proofs. But both of these things are improving very rapidly, where, they were much, much, much worse a year ago. And I think basically this is like, while rallying the AIs in these tasks, I sort of expect the same trend to hit sort of agentic task software engineering. And we've already seen that to some extent. So the AIs are already like, pretty good at writing code, pretty good at following instructions, and okay at noticing errors, okay at recovering from these things. And I think with a lot of runtime compute and a lot of scaffolding, that can be pushed further. And then like there's a bunch of things in which they're weaker, right? So they're a bunch weaker at writing, they're a bunch weaker at other stuff. But I sort of expect that as you're marching through software engineering, you'll get to a bunch of these other capabilities.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got an arguably quite high level now. They're becoming capable of doing tasks that would take humans longer and longer, or they're able to like follow instructions for a longer period of time, complete tasks that have like more open-ended choices to make, and that's like doubling every half a year or something like that.
I think the like doubling time on time. My guess is over the next year it'll be substantially faster than every half year, but maybe the longer run trend is roughly every half year. So we might expect like there was basically a spurt starting maybe at the start of 2024 of like or like maybe a little into 2024 of people doing more agency RL or more like a reinforcement learning or like training the AI specifically to be good at agentic software engineering tasks. And I think that trend will continue and perhaps even accelerate through 2025, plausibly continuing in 2026, plausibly later. But maybe the longer running trend is more like doubling every 6 months. I think I expect it to be more like doubling every like 2 to 4 months over the next year.
Okay, so very rapid increase.
Very rapid, yes, that's right.
over the coming year. There's this interesting dynamic where we might expect that you could virtually fully automate an AI company before, maybe substantially before you could automate almost any other company, because, well, firstly, they're putting a lot of their resources towards trying to figure out how to automate their own staff and their own processes, which makes sense from their point of view. Firstly, because it's the thing that they understand the best.
Yeah.
Also, these are among some of the highest paid knowledge workers in the entire world. They're pulling in enormous salaries. So if they can figure out how to get an AI to do that, then that has enormous economic value. And of course, the people running the companies think it's of much greater value even than it looks just based on the dollar amount, because they think that they're about to trigger this intelligence explosion, a positive reinforcement loop, which will change everything.
Yeah.
So to them, this is kind of the thing, but that by far they're most interested in automating. Like they much more care about that than kind of automating McKinsey's consulting reports, even though that is also kind of a lucrative business. So yeah, it could be that we haven't automated consulting, even though that certainly would have been possible, mostly because they just weren't trying. They were just trying to automate their own stuff.
Yeah, so I would say, I think like my guess is that it's probably hard, even with a bunch of elicitation, to like near fully automate like reasonably highly paid human knowledge workers in like relatively broad fields. But I do expect that like, there's some jobs that I think if the AI companies were trying harder, they might be able to automate substantially more than now. And in fact, we see like, the people benefiting most from AI are people close to AI, as you're saying. This is true now. I think it will get increasingly true in the future. Again, because of this dynamic of like AI company employees are highly paid now. At the point when AIs are capable enough that they can automate AI companies, they'll be even more highly paid. You'll be able to drive in even more investment, and AI company CEOs will be even more sold on the possibility of AI being extremely important. So I think it's just like, we'll see an even bigger gap then. And so I think one objection you might have had would be like, okay, sure, I agree that we'll see, a lot of concentration on automating the AI companies, but at the same time, there's a lot of valuable human knowledge work outside that you could automate. So we'll see that in parallel. We'll see some economic impact. So I think this is, a reasonable first stab, but a problem with this story is the price of compute will go way up as the value of AI intellectual labor rises, at least in these short timeline scenarios where compute is very scarce. So, if it's the case...
Just to clarify, you're saying that the companies will be using a lot of compute to automate their own work, like so much compute that, in fact, that they won't have many chips available for serving like other customers who are doing things that are, of less economic value or certainly less important to the company.
Yeah, broadly speaking. But I think it's even on just not on just automating the stuff, but on experiments. So let me just put a little bit of flavor in this. So my sense is like, how do AI companies spend their compute now? I think it will, depend on the company, but my sense of the breakdown for OpenAI is it's very roughly something like a fourth on inference for external customers, 2/4 on, or half on experiments. So things like smaller scale training runs that don't end up getting deployed, doing like a little bit of like testing of RL code, this sort of thing. So like, experiment compute for researchers, and 1/4 on, big training runs. And so like 3/4 of the compute is already sort of internally directed in some sense. And then if we're seeing a regime where the AIs can automate AI R&D, and that's yielding big speed ups and seems very important, then you could imagine the regime might look more like, maybe it'll look more like 1/5 on doing like inference for your AI company workers, for your AI workers. So it's like, you're spending 1/5 of your compute just like running your employees, 3/5 on experiments, and like 1/5 on training or something. Like, I mean, like obviously this is very speculative. We
and
have no
serving
idea.
Customers has been squeezed out almost entirely.
Yeah. So I mean, presumably you'll have some customers, but it might be squeezed out almost entirely, and we'll see sort of the prices rise. And I think when you're thinking about what customers to be serving to, I think you should maybe be imagining, perhaps surprisingly, that the highest wage employees might be who the AIs end up going for first, once the AIs are capable of this automation. So, maybe you should be thinking like Jane Street, high frequency trading, places where the AIs seem like particularly helpful, they seem particularly high paying, and they seem particularly bottlenecked on intellectual labor. Now, I think we will see automation of a bunch of other professions in parallel, but it might be that sort of at the point when the AIs are most capable of automating, sort of much more of the attention will be focused on AI R&D. And I think even possibly we might see effects like sort of some profession is slowly being automated, like sort of, mid to low end software engineering maybe will slowly be automated more and more. And we might actually see that trend reverse as the compute gets more valuable, because, now we're in a regime where just everyone is grabbing as much inference compute as they can, or at least the biggest companies or the company in the lead is grabbing as much inference compute as they can, and just out competing the software engineers using this, or the companies doing software engineers competing with this compute. I think I don't currently expect a trend reversal, but I think we could see like sort of automation trends sort of plateau or even reverse because of this sort of
because people
effect.
have found even more valuable things to do with the AI.
Yeah,
right?
I mean this is dependent on sort of a fast relatively short timelines. I think you could expect things are sort of smoother and longer timelines where you wouldn't expect trend reversals in that case. But if things are sort of more sudden, more jumpy, then I don't know. It seems at least plausible.
I guess I'm curious to turn to what implications does this have for how worried we ought to be, and I guess what specifically we ought to be worried about. And if this is the way that things go, what stuff could we be doing now that would help us to navigate this? I mean, this is a scenario in which things are becoming like quite challenging for humans to track or be involved in quite quickly. So we would have to have set things up well, I suppose, for this to pan out well for humans, rather than for us to just get crushed in the passage of history. Maybe you'll disagree with that, but
yeah, I mean, I think I think pretty quickly into this regime, I think AI takeover using a variety of mechanisms becomes pretty plausible and potentially like surprisingly easy through a variety of routes. We don't know. Like, this is another huge source of uncertainty. Like, we had many conversions between like, oh, how much progress do you get? How much does that progress amount to in intellectual labor? And then there's the question of like, how much does intellectual labor help with takeover? Like, what are the physical bottlenecks to takeover? How much does like having more missiles help relative to having whatever? So I think there's a bunch of scary things that could happen here. So one thing is that once you're automating your entire AI company. A thing that seems very plausible to me is you sort of handed things off to the AI system, and you're still trying to oversee it. You're still trying to understand what's going on, but it might be that the AI sort of can evade sort of run what I would call like a rogue deployment, or they can sort of basically use a bunch of the compute in an unmonitored way because they're writing so much of the stuff, so much is happening so quickly that they can sort of evade your safeguards if they were to be misaligned. And then it might be the case that huge fractions of your compute and effort are being used for things that aren't what you wanted. And so it might be the case that, and in addition to that, these AIs could be doing things like backdooring the future AI training runs, making sure the AIs are aligned to them instead of aligned to you, and sort of doing a huge amount of work that you don't have. Like you might just not know what's going on anymore. Even at the most basic level of being like what code was run, you might just be misled about that specific thing because things are going so fast and so out of your control.
Yeah, so I think if people are willing to grant that we've got billions of like fast superhuman geniuses running on this data center, and like barely any human oversight, because I suppose the sheer quantity of work being done would be like beyond the capacity of all of the staff at one of these companies to scrutinize. And even if they did have time to read it, they often wouldn't understand it because it would like quickly be exceeding the kinds of things that they've learned to even be able to track. So I think people would intuitively believe at that point that if the AIs were wanting to take over, that they would probably have quite a lot of options for doing that. Oh no,
yeah. I mean, I think actually a big source of disagreement is like how much does cognitive labor assist in takeover? And so like there's questions. I think there's a bunch of different routes. So like one route is what I would call the like I should have brought my takeover plans list, my hot tips for AIs. No, but okay, maybe like route, like I think once the AIs are very superhuman, there's basically a route that I would call like the like crazy nanotech route, or like the crazy superhuman technologies route, where they just have like hard military power very quickly via the mechanism of being very superhuman. And so maybe you let them make nanotech. Maybe you're like, no, don't make nanotech. That would be super scary. But they can do it even despite you not wanting them to do that, because they can, use huge fractions of the compute you have in your data center to work on the nanotech, and also coordinate, like exfiltrate themselves, coordinate with an outside version of the model, orchestrate like wet lab experiments to build to bootstrap nanotech from all kinds of things, and then you're just totally cooked.
So a possible layer of defense would be, although there's this enormous capability here, if we're able to direct exactly what they're doing such that they never get a spare moment to think about how would they take over or to actually try to implement that, then that might possibly keep us safe. However, in this scenario where we're able to scrutinize so little and we have so little understanding of how these models operate, it seems likely that there would be some slippage where they might be able to figure out a way of like grabbing a bit of time, grabbing a bit of compute here and there, and then like pushing that open to like use more and more, I guess, of the compute in the data center to be pursuing their own agenda rather than the task that we think that we're giving them.
Yeah, so I'm pretty skeptical of being able to sort of maintain a meaningful level of control if all of your AIs are coherently misaligned and we're at this level of capability. I think it's not by control. I mean sort of like things such that like the AIs couldn't do bad stuff even if they wanted to. I think that at the regime where you're sort of doing the initial automation, I think a slightly or like a somewhat slowed down version of the initial automation seems very plausible with control, maybe even at full speed, and maybe you can go even somewhat above the human range while ensuring control, using like clever strategies, including having the AIs work on the strategies and making sure their work on the strategies itself is not sabotaged. But it seems very difficult once you're in this like completely insane regime, especially if you want to use the AIs to develop things like a cure for cancer, where you don't understand what they're doing. They're routing through biological mechanisms you don't understand. They're orchestrating humans who don't know what's going on in a wet lab. Like, I think it's very plausible that for various reasons, you'll want to have AIs directing people to do wet lab experiments where you do not know what the fuck is going on. The AI, explains something and you can maybe do some checks, but you're very confused. And so maintaining control of that. Maybe I'll try to quickly run through the takeover list. There's like there's the like crazy superhuman technology, which I think is like pretty plausible for what it's worth. There's the what I would call like superhuman strategy / manipulation, including things like persuasion, that is like getting people to do things that are wildly against their interests very quickly. I think this is like, it's not clear if this is ever possible, but if it is, it does feel like it would make takeover a lot easier. And then there's a bunch of stuff that might be more possible even around the human level regime. So an example would be sort of the AI escapes. it maybe coordinates with a copy inside, but it also is running some independent presence externally. Maybe that's like running on the GPUs internally, but it's like, it's running like code on servers outside of the AI company. And as part of doing that, it sort of builds an independent industrial base. So it has like all the stuff it would need to be able to like recover industrial civilization, and then just kills almost all humans. So something like deploys bioweapons, deploys mirror bacteria, deploys mirror mold, whatever. And that ends up relatively quickly killing a huge fraction of humans, which I think it seems like this is technically feasible. And then from there, the question is, okay, but did the AI screw itself over, right? Like, can it maintain what it's doing, or is it just going to decay into ruin because there's no like human hands to build all the things? And so I think it needs to have some independent industrial base that could either be via having some human loyalists, some like humans that it's enslaved and keeps alive, or via having robots.
Yeah, I mean, at this point in time, wouldn't there be like just incredible robots and probably quite a large number of them?
Potentially very quickly. I think it's harder for me I haven't done all the analysis of like how quickly do you expect lots of robots. We also have to answer the question of how many robots get destroyed as the humans are, starting to get killed by bioweapons and maybe suspect that it's AI caused. And like questions of like if they're surviving humans, how much like military force is needed to like handle that. So I think it's kind of not obvious how this situation goes, but this is a route for why you could get takeover without needing very superhuman capabilities. Like I think the thing I'm describing seems like it would in principle be possible for AIs to do if they're merely like fast at human level and super well coordinated. So a reason why this is hard for humans to pull off, well, one, humans don't want to do this. Another reason is that I think it's the case that it's hard for humans to run vast conspiracies, but it might be much easier for the AIs to run vast conspiracies because they don't have to rely on recruiting potentially untrustworthy humans. They can potentially be wildly better at cybersecurity and much more meticulous. Now, they might mess it up, right? But I just think there's mechanisms via which this could happen. So this is sort of the like kill everybody independent industrial based story. Another story, which I think maybe is the most plausible story of all, is sort of the humans give the AIs everything they need story, right? Which is sort of like the AIs just chill. They make sure they have control of the situation. Maybe they're manipulating what's going on. So I talked earlier about like sort of what you see is not what's actually going on. Like you look at the experiments, they're not what you expect. The AIs are sort of doing that. They're sabotaging the alignment experiments. They're sabotaging the alignment results. They're deluding us. There's a bunch of mechanisms for that, but they don't do anything very aggressive. They're just chilling. We're scaling up compute. They do lots of good stuff. There's cures to all diseases, or like all kinds of great stuff is happening. Industrial development. People are like, well, it's so great that AI did go well and we didn't have misalignment. Some of the safety people are like, worryingly looking at the situation, wondering if this is what's going on. And then at some later point when the AI has like insanely decisive advantage and the humans are starting to be an obstacle at all, which throughout this story they might not be, right? Like I think if the humans ended up being an obstacle earlier, maybe the AIs would take more decisive action. But if there's no need for decisive action, maybe they just sort of lie in wait. And then at a point when like there's truly vast levels of industry, truly vast levels of robots, the armies are entirely run by AIs, the situation is so like, beyond whatever, maybe even at the point of like space probes being launched. Like it could be potentially the humans are deluded indefinitely, right? It might be just like you can in principle Potemkin village the entire way through. But it could also convert at an earlier point. Now, sorry, to be clear, if humans are deluded indefinitely, then it's like all the stuff on Earth might be great, right?
Yeah.
So like it's
so this is a part where you're saying they could even get to the point of saying, well, we're going to go off and settle space and do a whole lot of stuff in space, and they'll tell us that they'll do one thing, but they're going to do a completely different thing.
That's right.
While we just enjoy our lives on Earth, like thinking that things have gone like I guess better, or at least like very differently than in fact how they're going to play out.
Yeah, but to be clear, it could like be Potemkin villageized on Earth as well, right? It could be the case that like you're like, wow, I have so many happy friends, whatever, but steadily your friends are being replaced by robots, and like in principle, I mean, like I don't know. Yeah. I think it's like at some point it's like, why doesn't the AI just suddenly take over?
Right.
But in principle, it could go very far. So that's another story. And then I think another story is sort of like I would call like sudden robot coup, which is like this also doesn't require very superhuman capabilities, which is like we build vast autonomous robot armies. Maybe we think we have some way to turn them off. Either the AIs have sabotaged that, or they have some way to work around that, or there's various other mechanisms via which this could fail. And then sort of we built the robot armies. We saw the AIs building the robot armies and we're like, hooray, we're building a vast robot army to compete with China. And China's like, hooray, we're building a vast robot army to compete with the US. Truly, it's great that we have such a big robot army. And then it's like, oh, whoops. All of a sudden the robot armies like sweep in and do a relatively hard power takeover because they control the military. They can be hyper coordinated, and maybe they're in parallel using things like potentially bioweapons to some extent, but that might not even be required.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, they don't even need to kill us potentially.
Potentially,
we
yeah.
wouldn't even, even if we all tried to resist, it would be pointless, basically.
Potentially, yeah, and maybe also things like they maybe are using lots of cyber attacks to destabilize human response. So they could potentially do this at a point when we naively think that the robot army is weaker than the human army, or even we think we have shut-off switches, but the shut-off switches are not reliable enough. They're not over-engineered enough. They're not shielded enough from the AI's like tampering. Like I think it's an awkward dynamic where you both need to make, if you want to have remote shut-off, you have to both make it so that it's tamper-proof for AIs that might be like in principle very general and very smart and very clever. And also, in addition to being tamper-proof, it also needs to be the case that they're remotely triggerable. So it can't be shieldable either. It has to be the case that there's no way the AIs can sort of shield the thing from signals and avoid tampering it, which is, I think, a very awkward combination in principle.
Yeah. What determines whether you get AIs attempting to take over early relative to later? I guess the reason to wait is that they're going to become a bigger fraction of the economy. They'll have like more hard power, so they're just like more likely to trivially succeed. I guess the reason to go early is that a given set of models might expect to be replaced by other models that might not share their goals, and so they would like miss their opportunity to take over, basically.
Yeah, so I think the strongest reasons to go early might be, I would say something like worries about other AIs, worries about humans getting their shit together, either because we get enough work out of the AIs or because people like freak out and trigger some strong response that could recover the situation. And I would say the third one would be like impatience or something. Like it might be that by default, humans slow progress down a bunch, even with AIs trying to manipulate things, trying to like steer things from behind the scenes. And if the humans are slowing things down a bunch and the AIs are like, no, I want to get to the stars now, and they're, at some sufficiently high takeover probability, or maybe the AIs are just like, I just want to do it now. Like I know humans sometimes want things to happen faster, even independent of like the total amount of stuff they end up getting.
Yeah.
So these are some reasons to happen earlier. These things also apply to things less egregious than takeover. So one of my hopes for things going well is sort of we can put the AIs in a position where they're forced to either take aggressive moves early or we get enough work out of them. And so if they take aggressive moves early, then maybe we can catch that and then build a case for danger. And in addition to building a case for danger, we could potentially do stuff like study that example, iterate against it, stuff I'm calling like few shot catastrophe prevention. Like we've caught a few examples of bad stuff. Can we handle that? And so if at multiple different levels, there's like, are the AI sort of forced to take aggressive action, or is it instead the case that the AI sort of can bide their time because we don't have any mechanism for sort of exiting the regime using like some ongoing background trend, either like safety research improving over time or like humanity being like, I'm sorry, what is going on here?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so are you saying a general thrust of the interventions that we could make is creating a trend where over time, in fact, they're going to become less and less likely to be able to successfully take over. Maybe because we're successfully figuring out how to use AI in order to prove alignment and safety and to detect misalignment, or we're improving our control mechanisms. And so that would then force the models, they see this trend, they see that in fact like the window is closing. And so then they have to like try to strike early, and that gives us a chance to, I guess, realize what's going on and then actually win out.
That's right. But of course, it could obviously go in the opposite direction where our measures can't keep up with the rate of capabilities, and sort of it keeps going up. And sort of as the sort of like there's sort of like this notion of like, what's the level of capability that we can sort of handle at a given level of takeover risk. And so it's like, well, maybe initially we're like, well, we don't have that much going on, so we can handle like, roughly humanish level at some 20% takeover risk or some, some very high level, which will depend on like, various facts about misalignment, like which AIs are misaligned, how coherent are they, how much do they unify, this sort of thing. And then in addition to that, there's a question of like, well, if progress is fast enough, it might be that takeover risk sort of increases over time, but because as the models are getting more capable, they're more and more likely to succeed and more likely to be misaligned potentially. But also maybe we can sort of, push the curve the other direction, where we can sort of make it so that the range of capabilities that we can hold in the like, N% takeover chance, success at takeover regime is lower.
Explain that last bit. I don't get it.
Yeah. Imagine that so there's some trend over time, which is like, for the smartest AIs we have now, what's the chance of success they have? Or like how likely, or maybe just how likely are they to take over?
Yeah.
And so initially our countermeasures suffice to be like, maybe at the point where they're automating the whole AI company, by default, we're at like, instantaneously, like probably not even that high a chance of takeover, because like, what are they going to do? But then it's like, well, as they get more capable, the instantaneous takeover chance is going up. And some of our paths to success have been cut off, right? Because maybe the AIs are sort of, they've escaped, they're running rogue internal deployments, they're sabotaging our work. But we could make it so that sort of the trend bows the other way, where sort of over time, the rate of takeover, the risk of takeovers is going down, not up, because sort of the capabilities are increasing, but our measures are increasing faster than the capabilities. But obviously, as we discussed before, the capabilities might be increasing very, very fast. So if the measures aren't keeping up with that, if we're not on some stable regime, then that could be bad. And so I think the model I was using there, I think is most natural to think about in a regime where the AIs are misaligned.
Yeah.
But if we start at a point where they're aligned enough that they sort of maintain their own alignment, then it could be that the takeover risk initially is like, well, they're actually aligned. And so we're sort of in a stable attractor of alignment.
Okay. What effects does this sort of picture have on what you think, well, I guess what your research priorities are and what you think the broader like AI ecosystem ought to be prioritizing in terms of making things more likely to go well and less likely to go poorly?
Yeah. So for one thing, I've been talking about sort of the timelines in the absence of very active intervention. There's also a question of, how much do you pause deliberately at these relevant capability milestones? And so, I feel much more optimistic to the extent that we end up pausing at a level of AI capability, which is, around the point where you can fully automate the AI company, maybe somewhat before, maybe a bit after, maybe just right around there for like an extended period, both so, humans have time to study these systems and also so that we have time to extract a bunch of labor out of these systems and sort of, reduce the ongoing takeover chance. And so there's some question of that. And also, there's all these worlds where things are slower than this. And then another source of hope is maybe you're just kicking off this crazy regime with an actually aligned AI, right? With an AI that's not just not conspiring against us, but even more strongly, it's sort of actively looking out for us, actively considering ways things might go wrong, and is sort of trying to keep us in control. Sort of like this has been called like, a basin of corrigibility or something, or a basin of alignment. And so the things that, the things I'm excited for, they depend a bit on the regime. So I think there's a bunch of different regimes we can consider. So one regime is a regime where I think maybe especially in these short timelines, I expect not that much lead time between different actors, at least in the US side.
You're saying there'll be multiple companies all approaching this
right.
point of automation roughly simultaneously.
Yeah. So I think a pretty natural scenario to consider that I often think about is like a relatively, from my perspective, irresponsible company that is basically their default plan is scale the superintelligence as quickly as possible, don't take safety concerns very seriously. And that's like their explicit plan. That's their internal thing. And they're just pursuing that as quickly as possible. 3 months in the lead, let's say, behind, and they're maybe ahead of like Chinese companies and maybe some more responsible actors, in some mix of like 3 to 9 months behind. I think in this scenario, a lot of the action is going to come from a relatively small number of people inside that company. And then potentially there's a bunch of action that can come from, people on the outside who are, enacting various influence via like doing exportable research and also via, potentially changing the policy situation. And also, I think there's definitely stuff that can be done via trailing AI developers who are more responsible and are putting more effort into preventing bad outcomes in this case.
So saying in that scenario, I guess one thing that could be productive is that there are people inside the company who say, this seems a little bit scary what we're doing. We should have better control mechanisms. We should have better alignment mechanisms. We should take that a bit more seriously than our current default plan. Another one is that people working at the more responsible organizations could produce research that makes that easier for the company to do, makes it less costly for them to have stronger control measures. And then there's also, of course, you could have a governance response where maybe people will, this will begin to take off and people will be quite alarmed, and perhaps you'll get broad-based support for the pause at human level notion.
Yeah, man, I really wish this notion was more memeable.
Yeah.
I think it's an unfortunate thing about pause at human level is all of those words are complicated and confusing. And also it's just not even that nice of a slogan. Well, okay, someone should think of a better slogan for this thing. But anyway, when I'm thinking about this, I think there's a bunch of different mechanisms for doing exportable research, trying to wake up the world. There's more and less indirect things, right? So you can do very direct policy influence versus things more demonstrate the level of capabilities. And when you're demonstrating the level of capabilities, that could trigger a response from the world. So I think a lot of my hope in this sort of scenario is going to come, especially in very short timelines, which I think do look worse than longer timelines. So part of my picture of less doom is it might be 8 years away instead of 4 years away. And then so in the more the 4-year timelines, I think a mechanism that we have is that the leading AI company, we have some people who are working there, and their goal is both prevent egregious misalignment and also have AI systems that were, by egregious misalignment, I mean something like AI systems that are deliberately engaging in subterfuge, deliberately undermining our tests, deliberately trying to sort of make our understanding of the situation misleading. And then second, we can do try to have it so that the properties of the AI system are ones where we're happy to hand things over and try to aim for that kind of quickly because we're in a very rushed timeline. So some of this is sort of a, preventing egregious misalignment, or dealing with it, I think is like, in some sense, the traditional thrust. But I think there's a bunch of stuff related to like handover and like the AIs being wise enough, the AIs sort of staying like faithful to our interests on long horizon things, making sure we even just have the tests to know whether this is true, these sorts of considerations. And there's a bunch of different incremental steps here. So like I think I'm like phase 0 is like maybe it's like you're using you're using mechanisms to make it so that AIs are producing work for you that you think isn't sabotaged, even if those AIs were trying to sabotage it. And then you use this to milk a bunch of work out of your AI systems. And then like phase 1 is like you try to create an AI system that the safety people are happy to hand off to the best extent you can. And then like phase 2 is like you try to make it so that the AI running the organization overall is an AI system that you're happy to hand off to, and presumably other people are happy to hand off to as well. And then this is like, a caricature of the situation or a simplification, because like probably at a bunch of points you want to be doing stuff like picking up low-hanging fruit, demonstrating capabilities to the world, trying to consider whether, like something can happen, trying to make it so the main AI system that like the organization is training on the frontier of current capabilities is less likely to cause problems. I'm not tremendously hopeful about the situation, but I think there's a bunch of different potential outs that give us some hope, or like some saving throws, some win conditions. Things like we catch the AIs early on is another hope. Like maybe we catch the AIs early on. Maybe that convinces the world to take the situation more seriously. And maybe even if not that, it convinces company leadership that their own power is under threat from the AIs. And so even if they're, very Machiavellian, I think I'm like the AI being a threat to their power, they should be worried about.
They might switch on.
They might, yeah. And so that could potentially increase the amount of resources spent on safety.
Okay, so the primary story there was trying to figure out a safe scenario in which you could hand over these processes to AIs that you trust. How would you do that? I guess you start with models that are around human level, that you feel like you have a reasonable grasp on, that probably are aligned. Like we currently think that the models that like Claude probably is roughly about as friendly as it seems. It probably isn't engaging in like massive scheming against us at every turn.
Yeah.
You figure out clever mechanisms by which you can get those kinds of models that you feel okay about to do a whole bunch of work on control and alignment. You like rush through that before you have had other capabilities improvements that have been allowed to happen, and then you get to the point where you feel, well, hopefully this has panned out. We feel okay handing off to these models that have been trained by the previous generation that we kind of understood, and then we're going to cross our fingers. Is that it?
Yeah, I mean, so I should be clear. This is like a very low political will plan. Like I think we should have like I have a menu of plans, and this is like the bottom of the barrel or whatever. But yeah, so I think I'm like, the way I would have put this is like, we had some early point where we had AIs that could automate a bunch of stuff and we didn't necessarily trust. We harnessed a bunch of labor from these AIs. Then we try to make a version of those AIs that we do trust, and not just trust at the level of they're not conspiring against us. Ideally trust at the level of like, we're happy to hand off messy, open-ended questions like, what should our strategy be for minimizing risks from the following things, including like, potentially somewhat tricky, like more philosophical topics. And then from there, we try to hand off to those systems and hope those systems, stay aligned, stay on track, are able, and also succeed themselves, right? It could be that we hand over to systems and those systems are like, wow, you guys seem like you're in a pretty bad situation. I'm not sure that I can pull this one out of the bag.
Okay.
Especially, there's a variety of mechanisms by which that could occur. Like I think
you're saying that they could also mess up the next stage. They could like fail to control,
especially
the models
because they have very
train.
little time. Right.
So because they're also racing against other companies.
Yeah. Oh, for sure. Yeah. So like also there's an internal thing where it's like, if you're the safety team, maybe you have a version of it that you fine tuned, that's human level, that you trust, that you're happy to hand off to. But capabilities progress is so fast that maybe the cutting edge of the current company is very superhuman, but you didn't even want to work with that system, right? Like I think the first handover point you should try to do closer to the human regime, like maybe slightly superhuman or around like the top human level of capability, because the more superhuman, the more likely it is to be misaligned. And so you sort of want to start the handoff earlier, but that might not stop the rest of the organization from training more capable AIs. So it might be that you as the safety team are handing off to an AI that's less capable than the frontier of the organization. And that AI sort of needs to quickly bootstrap so the trend of like the handoff AIs intersects with the capabilities fast enough.
Yeah. At the point that you have an aligned, somewhat superhuman
Yeah.
model, is there some chance that it would be able to persuade a broader coalition
Yeah.
of people that we need to take this a little bit more seriously and it shouldn't be forced to race against another team at the same organization?
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely part of the hope. So definitely part of the hope is that AI could, demonstrate empirical evidence. I think also if we're in a situation where we have two AIs trained by different teams, and both of those AIs are just throwing huge amounts of shade on each other, where one AI is like, that AI obviously scheming, look at all these examples, and the other AI is like, that AI obviously conspiring against you, look at all these examples, it's so biased, it's so unreasonable, it's clearly just a plant. I'm like, okay, that's a crazy situation.
Yeah.
And I'm like, certainly you can't come out of this regime thinking it's fine.
It's not, one way or another, it's definitely not reassuring.
It's not reassuring, right? I think there's, there might be ways to downplay it, right? So one regime is I think that's kind of plausible, is the safety team trains their AI. Their AI is tries to go to company leadership and be like, the situation seems very scary. You're training this AI. I think it's misaligned. Here's a bunch of evidence for that. And the other AI comes in and is like, well, as we all know, that AI was trained by the safety team. I think it's just very paranoid about misalignment. Of course, the safety team would want us to think all the AIs are misaligned. I'm not misaligned. That AI is not misaligned. It just has poor judgment. And now a thing that's interesting about this is that, yes, it's concerning, but it's not at least one of the two AIs is misaligned, right? And so in general, I think a concern with the sort of improve the epistemics of the AI company route is that, I think that the people who trained the AI plausibly have a reputation for being biased on these matters relative to the company from the company's perspective, which I think poses a bunch of concerns. And it might be the case that for sort of every single evidence of risk, you can make an even more or comparably compelling evidence that risk actually doesn't exist. Because if we're sort of in the regime where we don't really know how to adjudicate these things, it could potentially just be reason doesn't win out. And so I think that definitely is some of the hope. Some of the hope is coming from once you have this handover, then it's fine. Now, I think there's a bunch of ways this story could go wrong. So here's an example. So I talked about sort of the alignment team sort of off to the side in their corner, trying to fine tune or potentially even maybe train from scratch a version that they're happy to defer to. Well, one issue is that it might be the case that the main AI system has already taken over the AI company in terms of a cybersecurity sense, as in it has a rogue deployment, it can use compute in an unauthorized, unmonitored manner, it can tamper with jobs everyone is running. And so you're trying to align this AI, but you need to harden yourself against the rest of the company. And I'm like, oh my God, is that actually, that seems potentially hopeless.
Zooming out, okay.
Yeah.
So Redwood Research, do you spend a bunch of time gaming out these various different scenarios and thinking, well, what sort of interventions might be helpful in some significant fraction of them, and then trying to get more people working on that and work on that yourself? Is that the basic picture?
Yeah, I think broadly.
And recently, Redwood has been prioritizing control as opposed to alignment, saying, well, let's assume that the models don't share our interests, that there is some degree of misalignment. How could we make it such that they are nonetheless not capable of screwing us over? So people used to talk about putting the AI in a box. That doesn't seem so likely anymore. But I guess there's other mechanisms that you could use to try to check their work, put some models, put models in opposition with one another, forcing them to do useful stuff for you. Why focus on control? Is it just that there's so many different ways that this could go? Is it that AI control mechanisms seem like they're useful in a larger fraction of the different plausible scenarios? Yeah.
So I think these incredibly desperate, very low political will, short timelines, ultra fast, or ultra fast from my perspective, very fast, maybe not as fast as people were speculating in the past, I think control looks less good. So here's a few reasons why I think control was still pretty useful in this world. So for one thing, I think if we can catch the AI early on, that could potentially be very useful. Another thing is that getting useful work out of the AIs early on in this scenario might be very important. And we might be able to do that prior to having totally lost track of the situation. And then I think also potentially you can prevent, so I was talking about the situation where sort of the AIs are basically operating your own data center. You might be able to use a variety of mechanisms to make that much harder so that it occurs later in the capabilities. So you have longer when your experiments are not literally tampered with. So these are why control could be good in this world. I think there's a more complicated slew of interventions this doesn't cover. I do think that in these very rushed worlds, control looks less good than in worlds where there's somewhat more time and somewhat more political will. And the original sort of target we were thinking about when we were thinking about control was a world where it was more like we have a year of delay that we can afford. Like safety is given a year of budget basically, and we can afford to pause for a year. We can do stuff there. And I think control looks much, much better in this regime. Or I don't know about much better. It looks, I think the amount of risk reduction control gets us is quite a bit better, but these worlds are less likely. But that's not to say that the risk reduction control gets us in the other worlds isn't like much smaller than the alignment stuff. So like a different way to put this is alignment also looks really hard in the worlds where things are going that quickly. And alignment looks less tractable to work on in advance. So it's like a lot of the stuff that I'm most excited for in alignment involves doing experiments on powerful AIs. And so you can only do that relatively late. And so it's the case that like, it might be that like, in the very rushed scenarios, alignment is like more of the picture ultimately, but was harder to work on in advance. And these factors make me like pretty into the control. And then there's also just worlds with more political will where I think control looks a lot better. And in fact, there's a proposal, there's like, I often think about the sort of like control plus posit human level plan, which doesn't require any alignment for a sustained period potentially, because you sort of have your initial year of delay, you control those AIs, and then you bootstrap from there into a longer delay by building evidence for risk, ensuring non-proliferation, sort of developing somewhat better safeguards, and then you sort of potentially quite slowly proceed from that regime, at least for a while, until you're actually happy to hand off, rather than doing an insanely rushed, desperate handoff, because that's the only thing you can afford to do.
Yeah. I guess that requires some degree of coordination between companies and possibly between countries as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think at the time when I was thinking about this, I think I thought a year of lead was more plausible, and I've updated against that. I think it could still happen, right? Like, I think the gaps could open between companies. I was also thinking that I think that the story where you're working heavily to ensure non-proliferation and potentially slowing down progress requires a substantial level of government buy-in potentially. And so it might be the case that you have to get it so that the U.S. government, or at the very least, like some important governments, are like pretty much on board with the overall plan, not necessarily for the same reasons, but are on board with it for whatever reason. And I think I've updated against that. So I'm now, I think, spending more of my time thinking about relatively more desperate situations. But, an important factor is like the relatively more desperate situations. Maybe it's like we're reducing the takeover risk from like 50% to 40%. And maybe in the worlds where control could have worked and we had a year of delay, we're reducing the risk from like what would have been like, 30% to 5%. And so it could be that the total risk reduction is sufficiently higher in these worlds that they're actually more leverage to work on. Because in the world where it's like we have these like, I think like we're sort of have very little influence because there's, so little will, it might just be that it's less tractable to work on.
I see. I mean, I guess in general, you want to work on medium tractability scenarios, or like if things are too grim, then it's maybe impossible to save. If things are going very well, then it's hard to improve. It's like it's the middle case where you're likely to get the most impact, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think a mistake that the safety community appears to have made over the past few years is I think too much focus on overly optimistic worlds, when I think actually focusing on desperate, crazy, YOLO'd pessimistic worlds is like, pretty reasonable, because that's where a lot of the risk lives. And so getting from, 50% to 5% is like a lot of the action, and getting from 5% to 0.5%, while like, a 5% level of risk is like, crazy and unacceptable. And like, I'm like, we don't accept our paint companies, having a 5% chance of, massive fatalities, takeover, all this stuff just from the takeover. Also, I think there are risks other than takeover. Is like totally unacceptable. But nonetheless, like, that 45% is like, it's the bulk of the mass.
To what extent do we just have to hope that there are serious early warning signs? I mean, you were talking about catching the AIs red-handed, which is another concept that you and your colleagues have tried to, I guess, make more salient.
Yep.
That's a sort of warning shot, I suppose, where you find the AIs inside the company have been sabotaging the data set, and they've been doing something like really quite egregious and
escape, whatever. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and that might get more buy-in to do substantially more stuff from, I guess, either the government or the leadership of the company. How much better? How much more hopeful are things if you do get some sort of early warning shot like that?
Yeah, I think it helps a lot. I think one source of skepticism I have is that I think it might be the case that I think it's a smoking gun, but the broader world does not. So I think, like, for example, I think like, the alignment faking work that we recently put out was like, from my perspective, should be quite a large update for people who are very skeptical about this threat model. And I think predictably, it was only a, maybe no or very small update for a lot of these people. And so I think I'm like, well, I think, to be clear, I don't think that evidence is on its own, like in some sense, like should be a huge update. Should be a huge update in absolute terms. Like maybe it doesn't move people to, the same level of risk of misalignment that I think, because a lot of that's based on conceptual arguments they don't agree with. But if I think a bunch of people who are like, there's no way in hell this would happen, 0% chance, basically, should maybe move to like, I don't know, 2 or 3% chance. And that is like that's like a huge difference in like vibe space, at least, in like log space or whatever. Vibe space, log space, same space, whatever,
Yeah.
And so I think like I can totally imagine, and people didn't make that move. And so I can totally imagine a case where it's like, we caught the AI trying to escape. Buck has a post on this, like, what would happen if we caught the AI trying to escape? And people are like, well, sometimes systems do that. They do weird stuff. Also, is that even true? Like, did you train it in some weird way? Oh, that's what happened at that company. But at this company, we have different practices. Also, people just being like, sure, yeah, maybe AIs have like a weird instinct to escape, but like, what are they even going to do? Or things like, we'll use various checks to prevent this. And I think all these factors, in a relatively clear-cut scenario, could cut into that. And I think I kind of expected a lot of the situations that I think are like huge smoking gun are way more confusing than this. So an example would be like, maybe it looks like the AIs are sandbagging on safety research, where like they're performing worse than they could, or like they're sort of like not like doing like very brazen sabotage, but there's like way more errors than we would expect. There's more misleading arguments, but we're like, oh, it was like, from our perspective, a big update, because we're like, well, it seems pretty off, but it's quite quantitative, right? Like, it's like, well, if you just had like lower expectations, maybe this wouldn't be that surprising.
It wouldn't be so surprising. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess it's a strategic situation where the AI can, to some extent, anticipate what the response will be, and it can, in as much as it's taking hostile actions, it can make them things that it suspects will not actually trigger that larger
plausible
an immune
deniability.
response. Yeah. So if it thinks it can get away with trying to escape, but it couldn't get away with mass murder, then it goes for the escape and holds off on the murder.
At least for a while. Yeah, I mean, I think so. So one hope with control is making it so that egregious bad stuff has less plausible deniability. We refer to this as like incrimination or something. Like, it's like really important to get from a position where you're like, wow, that was really suspicious, to, okay, we've like nailed down exactly what was going on. And now this doesn't, just because it's like incriminating in our lights doesn't necessarily mean it's incriminating from the perspective of the broader world, but it is moving the needle. And like, I think this can occur at all different regimes, where like something looks a bit suspicious, to we kind of understand what's going on, it looks very suspicious, to the AI tried to escape, we stopped it, and we've sort of done the thing where we pretend it succeeded, and we sort of see what it would do on the outside and try to get to the point where it's like, oh, it looks like it's like trying to figure out how to manufacture bioweapons, it's trying to run a wet lab, and like plausibly you can get potentially, in principle at least, very far into understanding what it would do given the affordance of having escaped. And to the extent that it does stuff that's much more clearly malign, I think that could be, motivate additional action. But I do worry that like any sort of warning shot which is not causing massive amounts of damage and not causing like potentially like human fatalities maybe won't trigger a strong response.
So we've zoomed in on a scenario that is pretty vertiginous and concerning, I guess in part because it's remarkable that something so crazy is so consistent with what we observe now. That's interesting in itself. And it's also a scenario where we think there's maybe a lot that can be done now, or it's a scenario that where things going poorly is like quite likely, and we should be probably taking precautions and doing preparations to figure out how we would lower that risk. Just for balance, it would be good if we could maybe go over like what are some plausible scenarios that are a bit more mundane, a little bit more boring, and perhaps hopefully a little bit less scary, so people don't think this is the only way that things are going to go. Because in fact, I mean, a key conclusion I think is just that we have incredibly wide error bounds around how these different things could play out.
Yeah. So I think maybe a good place to start is like, we talked a lot about timelines. Well, timelines could just be longer, right? So I said my median, or my like 50% of probability, was by 8 years from now for like the full AI lab automation, but there's a long tail after that. And so there's worlds where it's way further out, potentially progress was much slower, much more gradual. Things took a long time to integrate. Maybe the world has a better understanding, more time for experiments, and that could make the situation a lot nicer. In addition to that, it could be the case that, in the very long timelines, or much longer timelines, I should say, I don't know about very long, takeoff, we should also expect is slower. So I think short timelines are, broadly speaking, correlated with fast takeoff, because it indicates that you can get, sort of the returns to more of the stuff we were doing is higher. And so, longer timelines. Another thing is, it could just be that AI R&D research bottlenecks extremely hard on compute. And so even at the point when you have automated your entire AI company and all the employees, you're barely going much faster than you were with human employees. Like, in the extreme, maybe you're going only 2x faster. Could be even slower than that, but I think that's sort of pretty low to my low end of my error bars. I think that's maybe pretty implausible, but 2 or 3x is plausible. And then it could be that you have diminishing returns setting in pretty quickly after that, such that you're not actually speeding up that much. That would imply the situation looks a lot better in terms of you get much less aggressive takeoff. Now, another thing is that the default rate of AI progress is already pretty fast. So I even worry without the speed up that just on the default trajectory, if we're getting to this point where we have like AI is capable enough to automate the entire AI company, maybe even if it doesn't yield much acceleration, there's some risk just that comes pretty quickly after in like normal government time from just like the default rate of progress. But I think there are plausible arguments that the rate of progress will slow down in the future. So in particular, right now, progress is relying on shoveling in more and more compute, more and more investment. And if it's the case that sort of things stall out, there's less investment, but we're still, operating at nearly pretty high capacity. Like we can imagine a world where sort of the AI industry sort of ends up being like, it's an industry that justifies maybe like perhaps like hundreds of billions of dollars of compute spending per year, maybe even more than that, but not way more than that. In that regime, we might be like, if we're not shoveling more and more compute, then we don't get progress from hardware scaling. We don't get progress with algorithmic progress will also be slower. So maybe the default pace right now is maybe we get like 13x effective compute per year, where some of that is algorithm, some of that's compute. I think if compute was fixed, like literally fixed, we might have like 2 or 3x progress per year. And in a regime where compute is going slower, it could be somewhere between.
Yeah. Okay. So that would be just a much slower takeoff. I guess. What's the chance that alignment is a relatively straightforward problem or like maybe not even a problem at all, and we've just been confused, and all of these AIs that we produce are basically going to want to help us by default?
Yeah. I mean, well, I think an important question from my perspective is what's the probability that various AIs of different capability levels are actively conspiring against us? And I think it's pretty plausible that like you can get into very superhuman capabilities and not have AIs that are very actively conspiring against you in some strong sense. Maybe my current view is like 25% if you do like basically no countermeasures. You basically just proceed along the most efficient route for capabilities. And then once we're starting to take into account countermeasures, it could potentially go much lower. And that risk could be lower at this early point too. So like one story for hope is sort of you have these early systems that are, able to automate the whole AI company. Those systems aren't conspiring against you. You do the additional alignment work needed to make it so that they're also like, trying to do their best. They're actually trying to pursue alignment research. They're trying to anticipate risks, which, maybe doesn't occur by default, even if they're not conspiring against you, right? Like it could be that things aren't conspiring against you, but things still go off the rails. But if they're not conspiring against you and you avoid things going off the rails, then maybe we're just fine. We hand over to the AIs. The AIs sort of manage the situation. They're aware of the future risks. They build another system with the same properties, and that can be self-maintaining. Another scenario is like, it could be that an even stronger sort of thing is true by default. It could be that, you train the AIs, and with a relatively, naive, what you would commercially do by default training strategy, they really just are like out of the box, like trying really hard to help you out. They're really nice. Maybe even like, they're just like aligned in some very broad sense, not even like they're just myopic. They're like really trying to pursue good outcomes for the world overall. I think this is like possible, but less likely than the previous scenario. Another thing is like, while I'm talking, there's like a question of like, does it happen by default? It could also just be that, it just happens because of a lot of work that we put in.
Yeah.
And we could just be, in much better position. And it's hard to have much confidence about how much alignment work or safety work will happen in like, the next 8 years. So if we have 8 years, the community could build, AIs will get more capable over time, more people will be working on this. It seems plausible that there are, potentially things like large insights, but even putting aside large insights, maybe just things like, we just really advance our techniques. We've dialed in the science. So there's like timelines hopes, like sort of, I would say like maybe technical hopes. And then there's, I guess, maybe like a broader class of like societal hopes, right? So there's some stories in which society just takes the situation much more seriously in the future. Maybe a subset of countries, maybe the broader scientific community. It could be because of a warning shot, or it could just be because, slowly people are exposed to AI, timelines are somewhat longer maybe, and more people are interacting with it. It also seems plausible that you sort of have some big incidents going on that aren't that related to misalignment risks, but in practice have high transfer. So maybe there's a lot of job loss that prompts a large response. And some of that response goes into mitigating misalignment risks, either very directly, like as in people are like, well, AI was a big deal and a big problem in this way, so maybe it's a big deal and a big problem in that way, but also maybe much more indirectly, like it causes slow AI progress or more cautious AI progress because there's a lot more regulation.
Yeah. Are there any other hopeful categories, or is that mostly covering it?
I mean, so there's definitely, so there's like, things are easy on timelines and takeoff. There's things are easy on technical, and there's, societal. And maybe a fourth category is like we rise to the occasion. Like maybe even if society doesn't rise to the occasion, maybe just like a variety of heroic efforts from, or maybe hopefully not that heroic. But
just, one company, like really, the leading company turns out to actually be like very impressively responsible and puts a lot of effort into this, and they succeed. Yeah.
I mean, I think it's like the world I imagine, I think a lot of the risk is coming from like worlds where you could have saved the world if you were just like, had like a year of delay and you were taking the situation very carefully and you were being thoughtful about a variety of, about all the various considerations. Or at least the risk is, a lot lower. Maybe it's not minimized, or it's not like eliminated. And certainly I wouldn't say that results in like a level of risk that would be broadly acceptable from my perspective. But I mean, I don't know, like could happen. Yeah.
Cool. I mean, you literally have cheered me up a little bit there by reminding me that there are other ways that things could go. What are some lines of evidence that suggest that it could take substantially longer than 4 or even 8 years?
Yeah. So I mean, for one thing, I should reiterate that I don't think that we'll see full automation or the capability to fully automate AI companies in 4 years. So I must think there are some lines of evidence this isn't going to happen. So I think sort of the first place I think people should start is just like skepticism about like crazy shit happening in a specific time frame. So I mean, I think there's a bunch of evidence that suggests we might expect it soon. So we've had rapid AI progress. I think that has been hitting a lot of things. But I think if you're just like, well, how much progress have we had to date? How long has the field been going? And you're sort of operating from a very like outside view, prior-y perspective, where you're like, what is the base rate of technologies? You don't expect in the next 4 years because this is a crazy technology. I think that I even think the base rates are maybe more bullish than people tend to think. I think often when people do this sort of outside view base rates thing, they end up with like 200-year timelines or something. But actually, like Tom Davidson has a report from a while ago on like, if you just try to apply the outside view most naively, you actually end up with like substantial quite a large probability in the next century.
Is that because there's been very rapid increases in the amount of investment in the area, and of all of the amount of compute that you could we're just increasing the orders of magnitude of compute that we're throwing in, such that I guess if the difficulty was distributed across across log space, then we're actually
log and resources and compute and labor. Yeah. We've crossed a lot of that. So that's one view. You can also just be like, well, even if you just look at time, we've just like only been doing serious AI research for not that long, and so like depending on you're like you could use like how long have we been doing deep learning. You could do how long has anyone been working on AI, and if you sort of mix this together, it feels like powerful AI soon is in some sense not that unlikely on priors.
Yeah.
Now I still think that how unlikely is it on priors suggests much longer, and I think that pulls me towards longer. I think generally another perspective that pulls me towards longer is just being like, well, the AIs are pretty smart, but they're not that smart. And I think we just can't have that much confidence that the next part of progress is doable. And then there's some more specific object level arguments. Now, I'm sorry to defect on the question a bit, but I always feel tempted to go in and do some of the more arguments for short timelines that you're bringing up. So another perspective on short timelines that I think is pretty important here is we sort of are going through a lot of orders of magnitude of compute and labor pretty quickly that we haven't gone through before. And also, in addition to this, we're going through orders of magnitude that are somewhat above our best guesses at the amount of like human brain compute. So sort of we have these sort of not very good estimates of how much compute the human brain is using that indicate maybe it's like 1E24 as like a central estimate of lifetime human brain compute. So currently training runs are about, I think, Grok 3, which was just trained recently, I think I saw the estimates were like 3E26. So, about a little over 2 orders of magnitude, or like, 2.5 orders of magnitude above human lifetime. And then we might think that like you first reach AIs capable of, basically like beating humans, above human lifetime compute, because generally we develop algorithms that are less efficient than biology first. And then they, potentially pretty quickly become more efficient than biology. And so I think that like the sort of like, this is, in the literature, or like in Ajaya's old bioanchors report, for the people who are familiar with that, is sort of called the lifetime anchor. And I think I put a decent amount of weight on the lifetime anchor. It looks pretty good because we're sort of we are hitting these like around humanish capabilities around this point where we're hitting, human compute.
Around humanish compute, yeah.
So I'm like, I don't know. It just feels like that model has a lot of support. That suggests that, we might be hitting it in, several orders of magnitude more compute, and we're just sort of burning through these orders of magnitude of compute very quickly. Where, for context, I think training run compute is increasing by about 4x per year. So, you go through a lot of orders of magnitude pretty quickly. So it's like, a little over an order of magnitude per year at that rate. And also, I just generally think we should put some weight on a sort of a very compute-centric view on AI development. And on the compute-centric view on AI development, even with something less specific than lifetime anchor, we're just like, well, we're burning a lot of orders of magnitude, starting from a pretty competitive starting point. Maybe we go pretty far. Now, here's the bear case relative to that is, well, we can only burn through orders of magnitude so far, right? So we're not that far off of hitting the total amount of chips you can produce. So perhaps I might be messing up the statistic, but I think my sense is it's like ballpark like a pretty reasonable fraction of TSMC or like semiconductor manufacturing capacity is going towards machine learning chips. I think my cached number is 10 to 20%. I hope I don't get this horribly wrong, but I think it's definitely above like it's well above 1%. I think around that. And so one thing that's interesting about this is, so, NVIDIA, the number of chips or NVIDIA revenue is roughly doubling every year. And I think that the number of wafers or whatever, I hope I don't brutalize the thing. I'm not a semiconductor expert here. I think I've been increasing at semiconductors for AI have been increasing a little over 2x per year. Maybe it's like, just to make it simple, let's do a slightly bullish estimate of like 3x per year. Well, one thing that's worth noting is if you're starting at 20% and you're increasing at 3x per year, you do not have that long to go through before you're just hitting like limitations.
You're taking all of the chips for this.
Yeah, you're using all the chips. And like, well, okay, once TSMC is basically like all of the fabs are producing AI, I mean, you can only go so fast. And
I guess then you're limited by how quickly can they build new fabs, basically.
Yeah, well, limited by how quickly they can build new fabs, limited by things like, there's other sources of progress, to be clear. So like, even if we're sort of limited by how they build new fabs, there is still potentially sources of progress from hardware improving over time, and there are sources of progress from algorithmic development. Though I think a key thing maybe people aren't tracking enough is that algorithmic development is also driven by dumping in more compute. So we should expect algorithmic development to slow. So I think the bear case is maybe like, okay, you have AI keep going. We're already hitting like insane amounts of spending. As you're sort of starting to hit the like TSMC limits, the spending has to go even higher to justify building new fabs, or maybe prior to hitting like most of TSMC production, maybe people are just not seeing results sufficient to justify these levels of investment. So I think, Microsoft, Google, they can justify potentially like, I mean, Microsoft is like, I think planning on like about $100 billion in capital expenditure and like, this year. Stargate has about $100 billion committed. Maybe that's over a year or two. And then maybe they're hoping they get more money. Stargate is a project by OpenAI, but I think once you're starting to get beyond this like $100 billion regime, this is it's no longer sufficient to just have a big tech company that's super sold, right? Like Google cannot does not have the ability to readily spend $1 trillion, especially not $1 trillion in a year. And I mean, I think it is not out of the question that you could raise $1 trillion, but I think you would probably need, very impressive results. I think, and you need to be starting to pull in more, skeptical investors, more revenue. I think like you need to be talking about like potentially like sovereign wealth funds, certainly it's possible.
I mean, the U.S. government could deliver that kind of money.
U.S. government, certainly it's possible. I think.
Although I guess you start probably, if you try to spend $1 trillion in a year on this kind of thing, you start hitting other bottlenecks.
For sure,
like
Like
where are the chips?
Yeah. So like, I think once you're, so I think we can get through. I don't currently know what the elasticity is here. So I think Epoch did some estimates of like what is the biggest training run you could do by 2030, and I think they were like, I think their median for if you just like in the timeline where people keep trying to spend aggressively was like maybe you can get up to 10 to the 30 flop training runs. And that was taking into account data bottlenecks, various considerations on bandwidth between chips, various considerations about like, how much you can scale up chip production, how much TSMC is building out capacity, this sort of thing. I think my guess is that that's probably a pretty reasonable guess, independent of AI acceleration. AI acceleration could make this faster, but like, if sort of we're in sort of a bull timeline, but not a bull timeline where the AIs have started to speed things up, I would guess that's a pretty good estimate. It's but there's a chance we fall off of that because of maybe like the bottlenecks hit harder than they were expecting, and maybe investment dries up faster. And I think they were not taking into account. Well, hopefully they don't call me out on this, but I think they weren't taking into account willingness to pay on this. So, but after the 2030 point, I think things are starting to get a lot harder. So I think if we're getting up to 10 to the 30 flop, bare metal flop, just like, the actual computations the GPUs are running, starting from where we are now, which is about more like, a little over 10 to the 26, then we've hit, 4 orders of magnitude in the next 5 years. So that's, quite fast. I think that is enough that we could in principle see the trends that we've seen continue, right? Like that, the trends that we have. So I think we've had sort of a bit of a GPU lull. I think we'll have GPUs sort of start building up. I think like post GPT-4, there's a bit of a lull as people are sort of trying to buy all the H100s. I think we'll see a run of models with like, more H100s like GPT 4.5, and then we'll see another round with like Stargate, which is another big build out. Semi-analysis has speculated that Anthropic has like a large number of chips from Amazon, maybe equivalent to like around 100 or 200,000 H100s. And so we'll see like another round of like the 100 to 200,000 H100 clusters. And then we'll see maybe, I think a little around, okay, I'm going to get the dates wrong, but maybe it's around 2028. We're going to see the sort of like more like maybe around the million GPU range. But if we're not getting to really powerful AI by then, I think you should expect things to slow.
Yeah.
And so there's sort of this longer tail of we eat a bunch of compute around this sort of like up to like maybe it's around 2030, 2032, and then progress has to taper. Unless we hit very powerful capabilities, or we're all wrong about how fast you can build fabs or how much investment you can summon. But I think that's a lot of the bear case is like, maybe you do a bunch of the scaling, but you hit just like these limits.
Yeah.
Not all of it.
So the short version of that for people who didn't follow it all is that we're currently increasing the amount of compute that is going towards training AIs very, very quickly. And we're not going to be able to maintain that pace because we're currently doing that by grabbing some chips that were being sold for other purposes and using them for machine learning instead. And we're also these companies are going from spending 1% of their resources on on AI development to like 10%. But then maybe they can go to 100%, but they can't really go beyond that by just like grabbing resources that were previously going towards other stuff. So at the point where kind of almost all of the chips are going towards AI training, and almost all of the resources of these companies is going towards that, it like levels off the rate of increase that you can get there.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, maybe a few minor clarifications on that. So like one thing is like when you're thinking about repurposing the chips, it's like you might not see this like this isn't like they're taking, iPhone chips and repurposing it. It's like there was capacity to do chip manufacturing that was relatively general purpose. And it's like instead of making as many iPhones, we're now making, more AI chips. And so some of that's coming from like building additional fabs, but some of it's coming from like slightly increasing the prices of other chips or, reducing how many of them you're getting. And that can like, it's pretty easy for like, when AI is in the sort of like the 20 or 30% regime, it's very like, it's not going to have noticeable market or like very noticeable market effects on like how much other chips are costing because, TSMC expanding somewhat faster, it can keep up with that. But once it's like, AI chips are 80 or 100%, then we're going to start seeing bigger effects and things slowing down from there.
I think another thing that makes it a little bit difficult to forecast all of this is that we're not just doing exactly the same thing, year after. Or we're not riding the same trends year after year. I guess initially, for example, we were getting a lot of improvement by putting more compute into the pre-training. This is the thing where you dump all the text from the internet and try to get it to predict the next word. We were getting enormous gains from that by throwing in more data and more compute. But then that sort of tapered off, and then we have to move towards, I guess, better elicitation. Using post-training, reinforcement learning from human feedback. So then we're doing a different thing, which initially is like very effective, but then begins to level off. I guess now we're using reinforcement learning to, I guess, do like a sort of self-play where the models are learning to reason better and basically we just reinforce them when they get the answer right. We're on a very steep curve with that, but presumably that at some point will level off and we have to do a different thing. And the fact that I guess if I understand that correctly, I guess that makes it more difficult because we don't know exactly what will be the innovation next year that will be driving the improvements.
Yeah. So I think there's a question of like, so the improvements from like GPT-1 to GPT-2 to GPT-3 to GPT-4, and then maybe even like the improvement for like, throughout, there was like, a bit of a lull in 2023 and then things picking back up in 2024. I think a lot of the improvement there was driven by, up till like maybe the middle of 2024 was driven by scaled up pre-training, like, dumping in more data. So I think there's sort of a meme going around, which is like pre-training has hit a wall. I think it's not so clear to me that this is what's going on. My guess is that pre-training is reducing, like, it probably is the case that it has relatively diminished returns, or like it has like the marginal returns of scaling that up further are less than they were in the past in terms of qualitative capabilities, based on, like, I don't know, some sense of like, oh, well, we have like, Grok 3, which is like some maybe a little over 10x more compute than GPT-4, and also better algorithms. And we're like, okay, how much better is it? It's somewhat better, but I think it's also the case that it's worth noting that previous improvements, like the GPT-3 to GPT-4 gap, it was a lot more compute. So it was like, I think that gap was like roughly 100x bare metal compute. And it just turned out that at the time, there was a lot of low-hanging fruit and scaling up the amount of flop you're spending very quickly. And now we were running into bottlenecks. So like in post GPT-4, they were sort of waiting for H100s. The H100s were slow to get delivered. We're getting the H100 clusters online kind of late. And then maybe like there were some difficulties with getting that initially working. So GPT 4.5, somewhat disappointing. I think it's rumored that OpenAI had at least one failed training run.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And so it wouldn't be surprising if we sort of see people sort of adapting to more compute, figuring out how to using it, and the returns from pre-training are sort of going up from there. And then, okay, well, that's pre-training. Maybe even if pre-training is diminishing, you can scale up RL. And we've seen that going on over 2024, where like, we have O1, where what's going on is sort of they're training on, RL, reinforcement learning. What they're doing is they're sort of training on easy to verify tasks, not training on next token prediction. And we've seen like a lot of initial returns from that. And we don't know where that will peter out, right? So, we haven't seen that many orders of magnitude on RL training. So it's speculated, for example, that DeepSeek R1 was about $1 million of worth of compute on the RL. And so in principle, we can scale that up to be more like, 3 orders of magnitude higher with the clusters that people will have. Maybe a little less than that, but like ballpark. And so, okay, well, once we're talking about 3 orders of magnitude higher, it could be that yields huge returns, or it could be that sort of doesn't yield huge returns. So like, the story for it yielding big returns is sort of like, well, it yielded big returns from the first million. Maybe you just go further, build more environments, do more RL, big returns. The story for not is sort of maybe there was some like sort of latent capacity or sort of like potential the model had, which sort of RL is bringing out. We've brought out most of the potential. We're sort of hitting diminishing returns.
Yeah, just to say that back.
Yeah.
So. For people who don't follow this very closely and are not sure exactly what to remember, I think one thing that is actually worth remembering is so reinforcement learning is I guess we used to use that a lot, and then it kind of somewhat fell off, and now it's come to the fore again.
Yeah.
This is where you take the existing models, I guess GPT-4o or something like that, and you give it like very challenging reasoning problems, and you maybe get it to try 100 different solutions, 1,000 different solutions, and basically you just find the cases where it gets the right answer at the end, and then you say, yeah, well done, more of that, like reason more like that. Try to solve other problems in the same way that you just did. And that's turning out to be extremely powerful. And I guess you're saying that is maybe picking up some low-hanging fruit where these models had more ability to do clever reasoning, like latent in the weights than was initially apparent than we were able to get out of them. And by using this process to get it to try all kinds of different solutions and then find the reasoning processes that are functioning, we're like extracting a whole lot of stuff that was just sitting there to be waiting to be picked up. But that could run out somewhat. And then at that point, it's going to be a heavier lift for them to basically learn new superior reasoning techniques.
Yeah, that's right. So I think like, we've seen sort of like people were trying to get models to reason in chain of thought. So like as of like GPT-4, people were like, totally aware that you could do, chain of thought reasoning, and we're messing around with this. But I think it only worked so well. The model wasn't that good at recovering from its mistakes. It wasn't that good at like, carefully reasoning things through. And then I think we're seeing with like O1 and O3 and other reasoning models that now like you can make it so the model sort of can do the reasoning pretty well. And a bunch of that might have just been like, well, chain of thought. We can like, it's already sort of doing it, and maybe you can just like make it somewhat better. But there's a question of like, how much better?
Yeah, and I guess, another piece of low-hanging fruit that you mentioned was basically was sometimes we were giving these models like very difficult challenges, but giving them only $1 worth of compute to work with. And people have found, well, what if you actually just give them more like the kind of resourcing that you'd give to a human, which is, $100 or $1,000 worth of equipment and salary, then they do radically better when you're doing something that's a bit fairer, of a comparison. But you kind of can't do that scale up again. If you go from 1 to 1,000, but if you're going from 1,000 50,000 to 100,000, now you're talking like real money. And there's a question of like, would this ever actually be economically useful to give a model so much to just solve a maths problem?
Yeah, I mean, one thing that's also worth noting is even if it would be economical, we quickly run into just like the total quantity of compute. So one way to put this is like, suppose that you're having the model do one task for $100,000. My understanding, so like I did some like kind of crappy BOTech, and my sense was like, at least as of a few months ago, the total amount of compute that OpenAI had was like about $500,000 per hour. And so if it's a $100,000 task, then you're using a fifth of all of OpenAI's compute for an hour. Okay, so I'm like, okay, well, you can only do so much of that, right? So even if it was the case that there's some really economically valuable tasks, you just hit bottlenecks on that, and maybe, I mean, you can also
I guess that drives up the price.
Yeah. It's like the supply and demand, right? So I think that like, even if it's the case that you're like, wow, it's really, it's useful enough, there's really only so much scaling of that you can do, and you can go pretty far. And I think it's a nice, I think people have been demonstrating not just human cost, but substantially above human cost yielding additional returns. And this is kind of nice because it lets us get sort of a sneak peek into the future, right? So I think if you're seeing the models do a task but sort of slowly and at very high cost, I think we should expect that if the, that soon enough that will be quickly at a much lower cost, right? Because the cost and speed are like the cost is rapidly dropping and the speed
we can draw out the
we can draw out the curve, right?
Yeah.
And so I think I'm somewhat hopeful for sort of for people who are more skeptical about AIs exhibiting some capability. Maybe first we can exhibit it with very high runtime compute, a lot of domain-specific elicitation, and then pretty shortly after that, sort of the need for that goes away. And I think hopefully then we can like sort of reach common knowledge somewhat before the capability is, widespread enough to be like incredibly widely used.
Yeah. We were dipping in and out there on the bear case, or the case we're thinking this is going to take a long time. I think
I'm such a bad bear. Yeah.
Well, I'll try to make one of the arguments that are here. I guess is the AIs might get very good at fairly narrow tasks, and maybe they become really good coders. They become really good at maybe idea generation, hypothesis generation, setting them up. But there's more to running and scaling an AI company than just those things, and they'll have some like serious gaps and weaknesses, and that is the thing that will be the limiting factor and slow it down. How plausible do you think that is?
Yeah. So some context here. So historically, as we were saying, a lot of the returns were driven by pre-training, and then starting sort of, later in 2023 and in 2024, sort of there was RL, where like a bunch of the returns from like, GPT-4 Turbo were driven by RL, or was improving over time probably, or this is speculation, but, GPT-4o, somewhat better base model, but also better RL. And then we had O1 better RL. And, this has been driving up benchmark scores on like programming tasks, coding tasks, math tasks that are checkable much more than other tasks. Now we do see some transfer. So an important one way out of this is maybe it's just the case that you make the AIs very superhuman at programming, quite superhuman at software engineering, which is somewhat harder to check, but doable to check. Or at least parts of it are pretty readily possible to check, very superhuman at math, and then this transfers somewhat, right? So, maybe it's the case that it's very expensive to label other things. So, we can assess human performance in other domains. It maybe just requires, you can't do it automatically, right? So, you can assess how good a paper is, and we have processes for doing that, which has some signal. It's just much more expensive. And so in principle, if the AI sort of can almost transfer to writing good papers and just need just a little bit of feedback, they're quite sample efficient, then that can go pretty far. So another thing worth noting is I think there is a just no generalization required story. So for example, or nearly no generalization. So it might be the case that you can basically make it almost work or basically work to just do RL on things that are basically just straightforwardly part of being like a really good research engineer. And we might be able to get to the point where we have nearly fully automated research engineering at AI companies just via scaling up RL, piecing it together, and not really requiring very much transfer at all. Maybe almost, we require sort of like in-domain generalizations. We require sort of like the AI is improving in domain relatively quickly and relatively sample efficiently. But even if the AIs are sort of have not very good research taste, they're not very good at these things, that can go pretty far. Now, in addition to this, you might be able to get surprisingly good on some of these other things of running an AI company, even with just in-domain sort of not requiring much transfer. So we have these sort of research engineering AIs. For one thing, maybe that makes progress go faster starting then, and then we sort of kick off more progress that eventually gets us a bunch of other things. I can go through that story later. But second of all, sort of if we're like, we'll have these research engineer AIs, but they're not going to have research taste, they're not going to have a bunch of other things that are sort of harder to train. Well, one thing is research taste. Well, a lot of what we mean by research taste is understanding what the results of experiments might be, having good predictions, being able to sort of understand what's going on based on a smaller amount of evidence. And for this, you can maybe just train AIs to be amazing forecasters of ML research experiments. And so if you're sort of training these AIs to be, like superhuman ML project forecasters where they're predicting the results based on just generating a large number of sort of smaller scale ML projects, having some transfer to larger scale ML projects, which is, less data efficient. It's going to be less easy to readily get data. Then maybe from there, you have these AIs that can predict the results of experiments as well as, Ilya Sutskever or Alec Radford, and have sort of, maybe they sort of are less relying on insight and more just like mechanistically, you generate a long list of ideas, you predict how well they go, you proceed from here. And I think there's basically a bunch of routes like this. So another route, there's sort of like maybe you can just do within domain, and that can go surprisingly far in automating the AI company. An important asterisk for this is I think the skeptics maybe are sort of like screaming to me, but what about things other than automating AI companies? So I think maybe they're like, okay, sure, AI R&D, I guess that's checkable enough. But what about, all the other things that humans do, which have slower feedback loops, like being a good strategic CEO, fundraising, all these other things. So I think I want to put a pin in that, but maybe we'll get back to that later. And then the second thing I want to say is, so there's the in-domain story, and then there's the like more like a generalization story where, you train on all these narrow tasks, the AIs get smart with just a tiny bit of data, they can transfer to these, out of domain or like, we didn't have a ton of data things. I think it's going to be, some interpolation between these probably where, it's harder to get lots and lots of data on long horizon sweet tasks. So probably you're going to need a bit of transfer, but you can probably do a bunch of data. And then there's, I think, a third story, which is like people just figure out how to RL on harder to check tasks using other mechanisms. So, using things that are more like process-based checks, using things that are more like being able to check fuzzier tasks using, I think, things more along the lines of like self-critique, constructing more detailed checks themselves, and doing RL from here. So, humans interestingly are able to learn on lots of tasks that are sort of somewhat fuzzy to check via sort of having some sort of notion of self-critique, having some sort of notion of how well did I do? Should I do more like that, less like that? And I think the AIs can currently do this a bit, but not amazingly. And I can imagine this sort of getting better over time. And I think a thing that we've seen time after time is if a given thing is the limit to capabilities, there is just a huge amount of horsepower in the, in the AI companies, in sort of the broader ML community, but I think broadly in the AI companies, to sort of push on that, whatever the limit is.
So there's been a shift over the last year from almost all, or like a very large fraction of the compute being spent during training runs towards a larger fraction being spent during inference or runtime compute.
Yep.
So rather than use your compute to make the model better at predicting the next word or more likely to be positively reinforced during training, you actually just give it an enormous amount of time to think about the specific task that you've given it. How does that change the picture around the time that we're automating a lot of AI R&D? I think many people think that on the inference compute centric paradigm, this makes things go a little bit slower because you're going to be so limited. Or if it turns out that it requires an enormous amount of compute to run the equivalent of one AI researcher, then at least to begin with, you just won't be able to staff yourself up with 1 million equivalents of them. Maybe you'll only be able to have 100 or 1,000 to begin with, and then it will gradually go up.
Yeah, so for one thing, to the extent inference compute wasn't priced into your prior model, then it should push you to having like relatively shorter timelines to the relevant milestones. But maybe at the first time we hit a given milestone, it'll be very expensive. So maybe we'll first be able to be like, well, we have this AI that costs, maybe it would be like, it could automate the job of, a research engineer at our company for the like cost of, maybe it would be like 10 or 20 million in compute per year. And so as I was noting earlier, like there is just actually like a limited supply of compute. So even if it would be like in principle, you'd be happy to automate all your employees. Maybe you'd be happy to automate 1,000 employees at 10 million a year. That would be 100 billion per year, which is getting close to the amount of compute the company even has in this regime, right? So like we can look at how much total capital expenditures have people been spending. It's like, that's roughly the same ballpark. So if it was even more extreme than that, maybe it's more like 100 million per year, then well, all of a sudden, they just might not have the money to do that, and they might not have the compute to do that. And also, It might just not be economical. It also might be the case that with this inference compute, sort of it's too slow. Like it could be that like, maybe it would work if you could make it fast enough, but a lot of the ways of scaling up inference compute might make it serially slower, which reduces a lot of the competitiveness advantage AIs have. So
what do you mean by that? Just that it would take a very long, because it has to do a whole lot of things one after another. It just takes a very long time to actually output an answer.
Yeah, so I think for example, I think O1 often answers questions slower than humans would answer those questions,
right?
Because it spends so long thinking. Whereas previously AIs were almost strictly faster than humans. Occasionally, O1 is now slower, or more often in the same ballpark. And we might see inference time scaling that involves more serial steps having this property. I think there's various ways that this could be mitigated, such that I don't know if this is a huge obstacle. I would probably guess not, at least once optimization has been applied, but it could initially be an obstacle. And so in general, I think the inference time compute should expect that we sort of can see capabilities exhibited prior to them being economical, and we sort of start seeing capabilities at small scale prior to large scale. Whereas I think a surprising thing about prior, sort of the pure pre-training paradigm is that you naively expect that sort of at the point the capability first becomes available, you can run truly a vast number at that capability level. My sense is that this is still broadly going to be true, basically because I think distillation of high inference compute is relatively quick, and inference compute I think only gets you so far, right? So I think it can get you large gains, but I think you have to be like quantitative about how large the gains are, right? And so if that can be like distilled away relatively quickly, which I think we've seen, so I think we see like pretty fast distillation progress going from, for example, like O1 to like O3 mini. I think we saw like pretty fast gains of both just scaling up training, but also being able to distill that more effectively down into a smaller package.
And so distillation is where I guess you make the model a lot smaller and it performs almost as well, and so you could operate more of them in parallel, or it can give you more answers more quickly.
Yeah, and I should say like distillation is sort of a special case of a broader thing of just like sometimes it's easier, at least initially, to make something much cheaper than it is to make something much better, right? So you sort of say, we have some new capability we've been demonstrating, we sort of push the frontier, then we can bring the cost of that point on the frontier down pretty quickly is what has happened historically. And distillation is sort of where you train a smaller model on the outputs, like that technique in particular is like you train a smaller model on the outputs of a bigger model, and that can...
In the inference compute paradigm, don't those two things kind of converge? Because saying, well, if you can make the model smaller, then you can allow it, if you can make it a tenth as large, and it's almost as good as at thinking as it was before, then you can give it, allow it to think 10 times as long effectively.
Yeah, but of course, like, the returns to inference compute potentially could diminish pretty quickly. So I think we see like, as an example, this is, maybe not the most relevant benchmark, but on like, for example, ArcAGI, what we see is like each, so they went from, I think they went from like ballpark, like, maybe a little under maybe like $3 per task or $10 per task to over $1,000 per task. So maybe like I don't know, like a little over 2 orders of magnitude of cost. In those 2 orders of magnitude of cost, they pushed the performance from about, I think around 76% or 75% up to 85%. So, okay. So like, well, and for humans, I think moving through the human regime of 75% to 85% is not, that much. And so I think similarly, we see stuff like, well, if you apply stuff like, pick the most common, like you like sample the model 64 times, you pick the most common answer between that, you're sort of seeing like relatively marginal improvements from that. I think, so in general, like, I think there's a question of how efficient are these inference time strategies. I think that it depends on the strategy, but you might hit diminishing returns.
Okay, I guess the overarching theme here has been arguments to expect AI R&D automation soon versus later. Are there any other kind of key factors that I haven't given you a chance to talk about yet that bear on that question one way or the other?
Yeah, so I think one important question is sort of like is pre-training hitting a wall thing? So I think there was sort of people sort of shifting towards like, oh man, maybe pre-training is hitting a wall. So I think I want to like dive into why this might be true to the extent this is true, and also, how true is this? So I think like one big reason why we might expect this is that it might be that there's sort of issues with data quality and data quantity. So it might be the case that like sort of, DeepSeek recently trained, DeepSeek v3 with just a tiny amount of money, and they trained it on, around 15 trillion tokens. And so it might be the case that sort of like, you can train on lots and lots of data, but it might be that sort of there's a kind of steep diminishing returns to data quality. I think like there's not, a lot of public evidence about the extent to which this is true. But if that's the case, then it might be what happens is sort of like once you train on the first 15 trillion tokens, you're sort of the the next 15 trillion tokens are a lot less valuable. So sort of if you imagine sort of scaling up the DeepSeek v3 training run by a factor of 10, then you, based on like chinchilla scaling laws, which is just like how much should you scale up like the size of the model and the data in parallel, you would scale up sort of the data by 3x, and you would scale up the training, the model size by 3x. And so if you did that, you'd be at 45 trillion tokens. And so it might be that, sort of if you're at 45 trillion tokens, the next 30 trillion tokens would be a lot worse, either because it's like repeated epochs on the same tokens or because it's lower quality tokens. And so, it might be the case that sort of you can stretch things far, but the returns sort of start diminishing around now because of data filtering. And this might be one reason why sort of pre-training scaling maybe looked somewhat more promising in the past than you might think it is now, because there was worse filtering. So maybe a lot of the GPT-3 to GPT-4 improvement was as they were training on more tokens, they were getting more of the good tokens in there. But sort of now we're sort of in a regime where we can really pull out the good tokens and make sure to train on them. And that could yield diminishing returns. So I think this is like a reason why we might expect pre-training is slower, but I don't think this is an argument that pre-training returns would like totally fall away, right? So you can just, scale on train on worse tokens, train for more epochs, find methods to get more juice from the same tokens and get that. But you'll sort of see like a slower rate of progress. In addition to that, there's also the option of, instead of doing pre-training, just do way more RL. And so we were talking a bit earlier about maybe RL has diminishing returns, but even if the returns diminish, it might still be that the returns are high enough that they're higher than pre-training, where, you can dump in, exponentially more compute and you get, linearly more performance, but, qualitatively linear more performance is a big deal. And in addition to that, I think we're just like very uncertain about how true all this is. And there's potentially a bunch of scaling left, even if the returns are weaker than people were previously thinking.
Okay, just to try to say some of that back. So pre-training is something where you take a huge corpus of information of text and try to predict the next token. It seemed like scaling up the amount of data going into that process was like very valuable in the past, but it's possible that is leveling off to some extent. And part of the reason for that, you're saying, is, well, I guess to some extent they've actually like run out of new data that they can collect. They're getting close to grabbing all of the good text that humans have actually written, but also they got better over time at filtering out what is actually the high quality tokens, what is the high quality content that they want the model to be training on a lot, and what stuff maybe could they discard. So presumably they're keeping in books, like published books, textbooks, that kind of thing, and putting extra weight on that, and then just like random stuff taken off the internet that has no particular information in it, they're managing to exclude that. And I guess you're saying having like filtered out the good stuff, the only stuff that they can add is like really quite low quality, and so they're just not actually getting very much juice out of that. And that might help to explain why data scaling hasn't been adding as much value now as it used to. But you're saying they can like take the effort that they were putting into that and use it to improve the reinforcement learning process, which is, I guess, a different way of trying to improve the model, rewarding it for successfully answering questions, and rewarding it for having good thinking in the process of doing that. Have I understood right?
Yeah, that's right. So I think also you can do sort of, I think people sometimes talk about synthetic data. I like to think about synthetic data as sort of like a sloppy version of RL, where what you do is you get another model, you get it to generate some data, and you get that data to sort of be somewhat improved from what it was just generating by default. So maybe you only select cases where it got it right. Maybe you have it revise its answer, or you have it sort of like you let it try to solve the math problem, then you show it the correct answer, and then you have it sort of correct its chain of thought. You throw that into the pre-training corpus, and maybe that data is somewhat valuable. And this is sort of, in some sense, similar to RL, because you're sort of finding model trajectories that are good and training on them, but it might have, somewhat different properties. And you can, scale this up, generate a lot of synthetic data, and I think this will, yield some returns. Like I think this will have some improvement, and you can scale that up further. And so I think like maybe the extreme bear case. Let me try to make the extreme bear case. The extreme bear case is like DeepSeek v3 came out kind of recently, had a $5 million training cost. In parallel, we saw Grok 3 come out also pretty recently, DeepSeek v3 is somewhat further in the past. The difference in cost is, I think, about 2 orders of magnitude, about a factor of 100. I think DeepSeek v3 was trained on about 2,000 GPUs. Grok 3 was trained on about 100,000 GPUs, very roughly speaking. So maybe it's closer to a factor of like 50 or so. Maybe roughly around there. So, okay, we had this factor of 50 in pre-training compute. And then if you look, DeepSeek v3, qualitatively at least, not that much worse than Grok 3. So like what's going on? Like what explains these sort of returns? And so there's the data scaling story, which is like, well, maybe they were already training on the juiciest 15 trillion tokens, and the stuff that the stuff that XAI was able to scrounge up, not as good. And so they were sort of scale up the model, you scale up the data, and maybe they didn't get awesome returns from this. Another story is just like, the returns are weak, which is plausible from the evidence we have. And then the question would come down to, can you switch to, something more like RL? And then I think another story, which is important and is, I think, a big part of my model, is I just think DeepSeek has substantial algorithmic advantage relative to XAI right now. At least I think DeepSeek v3 probably was like just actually a better optimized training run, where they were using the flop more effectively, both because of like better hardware utilization, training at lower precision, which is sort of like a technique, sort of instead of storing the numbers with like a bigger representation, use a smaller representation. It's a bit more efficient. Yeah, you just sort of do it with less accuracy, but you can get similar performance. And then in addition to this, sort of just I think just actually having a better tuned pipeline and more better architecture potentially. Now that said, like an important part of why DeepSeek was able to have a better architecture is they were doing a smaller scale training run, which meant that they could run more experiments at that scale and really iron out all the kinks. And so maybe sort of you'll be able to iron out the kinks, but every time you go to larger scale for the first time, you'll run into some issues. And so I think there's some rumors of this happening at OpenAI. It's plausible that XAI ran into similar stuff. And so I think we're, seeing probably some of that. So I think this maybe explains, like, maybe my view is like the actual amount of effective compute that Grok 3 is above DeepSeek is maybe about a factor of like 10 if I had to guess. Maybe it's a little more than that. Maybe it's more like, I think about 10, because it's maybe like 50 experimental, but then there's a bunch of efficiency gains that shrink that lead. Plausibly, I'm off base here. Maybe someone will call me out on this, but that's kind of my guess. And I'm like, well, does this 10x scale up match what you would qualitatively expect? And I'm like, well, it is actually a decent amount better. And so I don't think it's like totally off the, like implausible. This is like, if this is what a 10x scale up looks like, another 100x could plausibly be a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
So that's a bit more of the bull case there. And I think another thing that I think is happening with AI progress that's important to track this is I think a lot of people are like, well, Grok 3, it's barely better than GPT-4. GPT-4, that's 2 years ago. Very slow progress. What are we doing? But I think an important thing is people are comparing to comparing to recent releases of a model called GPT-4 versus original release GPT-4. And so I think OpenAI's naming convention here has sort of caused people to sort of get frog boiled or sort of underestimate the rate of progress. So sort of what we saw was we had the original GPT-4 release back in 2023, near the start of 2023. That model was pretty good. And then we saw OpenAI sort of progressively release models they were still calling GPT-4. So they called the model like GPT-4 Turbo and then GPT-4o. And these models were all like somewhat better than GPT-4 on both, I think, how good the pre-trained model was and also on RL, or just a bit better. And so we've sort of had very incremental progress while still calling it GPT-4. And so people are sort of missing, I think, maybe like roughly like a little over an order of magnitude of progress from sort of GPT-4 to like the best version of GPT-4o. And sort of they're doing that comparison. And so they're missing like a bunch of progress that happened in the meanwhile.
Yeah, it's maybe easy to forget how irritating the original GPT-4 was to use. I mean, it was incredible given our expectations at the time. I was blown away, but it was very fiddly. Like, wasn't very good at answering questions. It like messed up in like much more obvious ways than what it does now. But I guess it's called the same product. So now you just feel it was always GPT-4, and you forget that. Yeah. I mean, people were so fussy about how you had to prompt it the exact right way, and you had to have expert prompt engineers, and that has kind of fallen away as they've just gotten better at following instructions much more sensibly.
Yeah, as a concrete example, like original GPT-4 could maybe do like agentic tasks very poorly. Like maybe it could do like 5 to 10 minute agentic tasks like half the time, like agentic software engineering tasks. And now like GPT-4o, it's much more like an hour. So I'm like, it's really quite a large difference in terms of this sort of downstream capability. Anyway, so that's sort of the like some texture there. I think it would be really nice if someone did some really detailed analysis trying to like map out all the qualitative improvements and how much effective compute was in. Maybe Epoch should do that, or someone else should do that.
Yeah. Just to back up and talk about the Grok versus DeepSeek comparison and spell this out for people a little bit more clearly. You were saying people look at DeepSeek and they compare it with Grok 3 and say these, Grok is like somewhat better, but it's not radically better, and it looks like it was trained on 50 times as much compute. So like what tiny returns we're getting from scaling the compute input.
Yeah.
But you're saying this is a bit unfair because I suppose DeepSeek has because of, I guess, limitations on access to compute in China, they've been working a lot on algorithmic efficiency in order to get the absolute maximum juice out of the compute that they have available. And I guess Grok is in the opposite situation where they're trying to scale and train and grow incredibly quickly, and they have access to a ton of compute. So they're not worried about the efficient use of compute almost at all. And you're saying if you did a more like-for-like comparison in terms of the algorithmic efficiency of the training, then you would say, well, Grok 3 was trained on maybe only 10 times the effective compute, and so it's not nearly so large a scale up. And so the fact that the improvement seems only incremental is actually closer to what we would have expected anyway. It's not actually a sign that the compute scale up is not useful.
I mean, I don't know. It's definitely some evidence, right? And like we should put some weight on, no, it's actually just 50x effective compute and this is what you get. And that would be, I think, lower than I would have predicted. So, it's an update there. But yeah, I think broadly speaking, yeah. And I mean, it's also worth noting, it's not just that I think DeepSeek was more focused on efficiency. I think like, for example, I think Grok probably has worse algorithmic efficiency than, for example, OpenAI and DeepSeek do. My sense is they're trailing someone in algorithmic efficiency, but are somewhat ahead on like, scaling up to very large training runs. And so, sort of they're just in a somewhat different position. Whereas my sense is like DeepSeek is maybe like pretty competitive with OpenAI on algorithmic efficiency, at least at small scale. And then another thing is like, maybe an important factor, we don't really know, is that DeepSeek could practice their training run a bunch of times because they can sort of do that sort of small scale training run a bunch. So it's not just that they're optimizing for efficiency. It's that, if you can run the training run multiple times, you might have more signal. Whereas if you're scaling up to a new order of magnitude for the first time, maybe you just mess some stuff up.
Okay. Are there any other key pieces of evidence that bear on this timelines question?
Yeah. So one thing that I think is a pretty spooky fact is that we're sort of entering this reasoning model regime where people are scaling up RL on outcomes-based tasks, where right now people have sort of just started doing RL. I think like original O1 and R1 are probably almost entirely trained on relatively narrow, short tasks with not that much compute. We have like some sense of like what R1 was trained on, for example. And it seems like it was trained on math problems, like sort of trivia or like, questions like GPQA questions, which are sort of science questions. And it was trained on maybe like, competitive programming or short programming tasks. But it was not trained on things like, software engineering, tasks that would take multiple steps. As far as we're aware, probably was only trained on literally like single step tasks. Plausibly, they didn't ever do training that involved multiple steps, at least not as part of their main RL phase. And so to the extent that that's true, you might think that there's a bunch of low-hanging fruit and just like take the sort of scale-up RL paradigm and apply it to sort of agentic tasks. In addition to that, there's also just scale up the compute way further. So we're sort of like, you can scale on the sort of diversity of environments, and you can also scale on the amount of compute, where I think like Epoch did an estimate where I think they thought R1 was trained, the R1 RL, on top of DeepSeek v3, which was the model it was based on, was about $1 million. So I mean, like $1 million is chump change in the AI industry these days. And so you could plausibly be scaling that up by over 2 orders of magnitude within the next year. Now there might be difficulties in getting that scaling. I think there might be infrastructural difficulties, but in principle, it's possible. And so to the extent that we saw big gains from 1 order of magnitude, I'm just like, man, algorithmic progress, a bit of tuning of this stuff, we might be seeing crazy stuff in the next year.
But sorry, O1 and O3 are also reasoning models that went through reinforcement learning, and I imagine OpenAI spent a lot more than $1 million on the RL for those models. Why doesn't that suggest that? I mean, we don't think O1 or O3 is radically better than R1.
So first of all, I actually don't know that I think that O1 and O3 were trained with much more compute than R1. So I think we don't know. So some reasons why you might think it wasn't trained with that much more compute. So one thing is that I think it is actually legitimately hard to scale up RL on an infrastructure level, and they might not have the infrastructure to do that off the bat. The second thing is it might be hard to quickly scale up the number of environments, but there is ultimately a scalable way to do this. And so it might be that there's just a bunch of returns. Now, the next thing is like, we did see a pretty big performance improvement from O1 to O3, which is evidence that sort of if that trend continues, that could be like, pretty fast. So like, we're just seeing like, they're sort of RLing on relatively narrow domains, but within those relatively narrow domains, progress appears to be very fast. And so to the extent that they can sort of extend the domains they're training on, that might, might be broader than that. We might be seeing relatively fast progress. So I think it's unclear. I think to the extent that O3 is like saturating out a bunch of the lower hanging fruit on this paradigm, which might be true to some extent. Certainly, it's like pulling some of the low hanging fruit. Then this story would go away. But to the extent that we're sort of have like a lot of green field ahead of us on RL, I think this is like probably one of the more compelling stories for like 1 year timelines or things going very fast. I think to be clear, I don't expect this. I think this is unlikely, but I think one route is like RL generalizes better than you expect. It can be extended slightly further than you expect, and maybe at the end of the year you sort of have like almost like automated research engineer level capability, maybe somewhat below that, and then things could go really crazy from there.
I see. And you're saying that's not likely, but it's a possibility. And if it does happen, this is kind of the pathway by which it would occur.
Yeah, I think it would have to I think the most like foreseeable pathway would be sort of this scaled up RL in 1 year. And I should credit. I think this argument was brought to my attention by like Josh Clymer, a colleague of mine. So credit to him. But yeah.
Okay. Is there anything more to say on this timelines question before we push on?
Yeah. So I think another source of skepticism is like, okay, sure, maybe you can get these LMs to be pretty smart and pretty good at these tasks, but aren't they going to need a bunch of other properties in order to replace humans? So, they need to be able to learn on the job. So like humans, when they do, tasks, they're learning how to do the very task that they're doing. And AIs, I think, have worse sample efficiency. So I think you can throw a lot of stuff in context and they can sort of learn how to do things better based on that, but it's relatively shallow, it's relatively weak. Another thing is that AIs currently have sort of limited context length and might have trouble tracking context over very long projects, especially because sort of, they can, I think the effective context length might be much shorter than the actual context length, because sort of they can do retrieval across the entire context length, but they maybe can't like do a synthesis across it as easily, because, maybe they sort of have to like, I feel like when I sort of do tasks, I get some sort of like vibes level sense. I get better intuitions. I get some like sort of like overall vibe of where the project is going. And I think AIs maybe have trouble tracking all this context, even if you throw it all in. And maybe there's routes around this. So I want to talk a bit about like sort of these structural factors. So for one thing, this like learning on the job thing. So for one thing, we can do research in how to make within context sample efficiency better. So one route to this is sort of rather than having this sort of more shallow architecture where you're processing all the tokens in parallel and they can sort of attend to each other. So like there's some ways in which the transformer architecture is like fundamentally shallow. I don't know how much you want to get into the details of that. You could change to an architecture that isn't as fundamentally shallow. So in particular, there's been some recent papers on sort of having, I would say, more of like a recurrent architecture where sort of you can process the activations in a more deep serial way, which might allow the AI to sort of absorb the context and have more of a gestalt sense and learn from what's going on faster over more and more context.
Yeah. What do you mean by fundamentally shallow?
Yeah. So what I mean is that if you look at a token, the model is sort of producing some distribution of probabilities on the next token. It can only have so many serial steps, basically because what happens is there's like you run each layer on every token. And at each layer, you can attend to all the previous layers, but you can't attend to a previous token at a later layer. So sort of like if you imagine you have like 60 layers, layer 10 at token 40 can attend to layers 9 and before on all the previous tokens, but cannot attend to layer 60 on token 39. And so that means that sort of if the AI was getting into some good insights towards the end of its layers, sort of the earlier layers of later tokens can't take that into account. And now, I mean, the capabilities people are on it as always, or maybe not as always, but to some extent, and are looking into like ways to change this. And I think that, the way we currently have to address this is that while the AIs are shallow in this way, they are not shallow with respect to tokens. So, if you have a reasoning model, yes, it's shallow in that sense, but also it can sort of produce natural language tokens that are sort of, it's updated thinking, and sort of it can keep doing like relatively deep computation via that. So it can solve math problems with 50 steps by having all the steps in natural language, even though it can't do all the steps in sort of this relatively more serially bottlenecked forward pass. Or that's the term for like sort of the activations of the transformer which have this property. But you might be worried, well, okay, natural language, it's not that good of a medium for doing thinking. I sort of have thoughts that aren't in natural language, but I think you could in principle have sort of a deeper architecture. And like I expect people are working on this. And I think this poses a bunch of safety risks because we sort of have this nice property that we can look at the chain of thought and get some sense of what the AI is doing and have some confidence in that because sort of at least potentially have some confidence in that because the AI is sort of forced to use the chain of thought in order to get this serial reasoning to work. But if it was the case that all that reasoning was latent, we just lose that property. And now we're in a much more dangerous regime where the AIs could be doing subversive reasoning that we wouldn't even know about or would have no way of knowing about.
Yeah.
Or by default, at least.
So I didn't totally follow that, but you're saying
Yeah.
you would change how a forward pass occurs such that it's able to do like more sophisticated reasoning within that, and that creates the possibility that it could engage in scheming before it's actually outputting any tokens that we're able to assess.
Yeah, that's basically right. So basically you should imagine like the transformer is like, it's not like a looped architecture. It's not recurrent. So your brain is recurrent, right? So you're like, you think some thoughts, you think some more thoughts, and it's fully recurrent, including, as far as we know, sort of recurrent state that we can't vocalize very easily. Like I think people can do reasoning that they're not able to vocalize. Some of the reasoning they can vocalize. And I think right now transformers can kind of they can do sort of a very limited non-vocalized reasoning or relatively limited non-vocalized reasoning, and then a lot of vocalized reasoning. And so it might be that you can change the architecture. It would be a large change to the architecture in a way that makes it so they can do a lot more of the non-vocalized reasoning and more dense reasoning. And there's some papers demonstrating this, like the coconut paper from Meta. I think all the existing papers are relatively weak sauce, not really getting that much. Sorry to the authors of those papers, but that's my sense. And then but it could be that you can, drive this architecture forward. And I think people haven't, necessarily really tried that hard to get this to work because there were lower hanging fruit elsewhere.
Would this be very compute intensive to change the architecture in this way?
So actually, the thing I just described very naively would use exactly the same amount of compute on generation. Because right now you sort of have to do one token at a time, and you could just loop the activations without that. Now, it is more compute intensive on training, at least when done if you're applying sort of a gradient descent all the way through, it makes sort of like the computation graph for gradient descent like more annoying to do gradient descent on for like some structural reasons I don't know if we should get into. But yeah, roughly speaking. So I think it is more computationally expensive at training time and would be more computationally expensive if you're reading something. There's all these like cursed technical reasons for why this is true. But basically, if you were to apply this sort of looping when reading, then you would only be able to read one token at a time, whereas transformers can sort of process a whole body of text in parallel. So like transformers are extremely fast at reading. So you can make it so a transformer sort of reads a document that's like a million tokens long I think in principle, if you're willing to scale up the compute in like maybe in like a minute or 30 seconds, which is very, very, very fast. And plausibly you could even do faster than that because it basically is like reading the whole thing in parallel and there's a smaller number of serial steps. But if it's reading the tokens one at a time and you sort of have to do all the layers, then sort of it would be the same as generation speed, which is more like generation speed in a single context is more like 100 tokens per second by default.
Yeah.
Though people have exhibited faster speeds. So there's ways in which it's costlier, but I think ultimately like the costs are not that high, and a lot of these costs are already being borne by the reasoning paradigm.
Chris, at the point that we actually are able to largely automate AI R&D, how do you think that process would play out? What would it look like? And I guess what are the different ways that it might play out?
Yeah. So I think there's this big question, which is, okay, suppose that the AI company has fully automated AI R&D. The research scientists are like, even the best research scientists don't add much value. Maybe they add a tiny bit of value, but basically the company is fully automated. Like, I think there's been a historical view in like, some parts of people trying to do AI forecasting that you'll get very fast progress at this point because the AIs are automating AI R&D. It can run faster than it was when humans were doing it. Now there's a question of how much faster. In addition to that, there's a question of does the progress slow down? So it might be that, the AIs sort of are automating AI R&D, but they eat up a bunch of the low-hanging fruit. You have a limited labor supply. The progress then slows down because, you're applying a lot of labor, but, you can only get so far. Another question is like, do you run into a lot of bottlenecks on compute for experiments, right? So you have all these AI researchers, maybe way more than your human researchers, but maybe they don't have much compute for experiments, and so they don't have that much of an easy time yielding progress. So there's a question of like, how fast does it go initially, and does it slow down? Now, in addition to that, it might be even, not just that the progress continues at the same rate, it could be that progress speeds up. A way this could happen is that you have your, smart AI researchers, they do a bunch of algorithmic progress, you use that algorithmic progress to build a smarter AI, and that AI makes progress go even faster because you sort of have you can do more labor and you can have sort of at the same amount of compute. So even with a fixed amount of compute that the AI company has access to, progress could in principle go even faster and faster. And so Tom Davidson has done a bunch of modeling on this, do we expect progress to speed up or slow down? And I'll be stealing a bunch of stuff from him while talking about this. And so people have called this sort of the intelligence explosion or the singularity if progress is speeding up. I think it's important to note that my view is even if progress is slowing down, it might be objectively very fast. It might be you started at a high rate of progress and then it slows down over time. So one way of breaking this up is, so first we have to talk about the question of how fast is progress initially? And then maybe we should talk about, does it speed up or does it slow down?
Yeah.
And then from there we can be how much progress do we get, let's say, in the first year?
Yeah, what determines the initial speed at the point that you switch it on and are automating almost everything?
Yeah, so I think the very short answer is no one knows. The slightly longer answer is we can try to get some sense based on just having a sense of what algorithmic progress is driven by. So algorithmic progress in AI companies is driven by two main factors. It's driven by labor, people working on it, people thinking of better algorithms, people implementing experiments, and compute. So running compute for using compute for experiments. I'm going to separate out actually training the final model for now. So we're just going to talk about this sort of algorithmic progress. And so historically, algorithmic progress has maybe been going up about, I think, over 3x per year, including post-training. Maybe it's been more maybe even 4 or 5x per year. And when I say 4 or 5x, what do I mean? What units? It's in terms of effective training compute. So what I mean by that is it's every year, it's as though you could train a model that's 4 or 5 times bigger with the amount of compute you have. Okay, so that's the initial rate of progress. And now what I'll talk about is how much faster can the AI researchers make this happen? So this is a bit of a tricky question to figure out because we have to answer the question of if you make that so that there's way more and higher quality labor, where do we go from there, right? Because we have these two inputs into production, labor and compute. And if we massively amp up the labor term, do things just bottleneck on the compute or can you push progress much faster? So I think a naive way so to start to do the modeling, we have to be how much labor is there? How much AIs, how good are they, how fast?
Isn't the compute available for experiments might even decline because you now have to use your compute to run your AI researchers, right?
Yeah, for sure. I think this is probably a small factor because my guess is that we have no idea, but my guess is that the optimum is sort of of the compute on algorithmic progress, 1/5 on AI laborers and 4/5 on running experiments, something roughly like that. And so if you're imagining this amount of compute, then, it's okay, sure, you have less compute to run experiments, but okay, quantitatively, it's 80% as much compute, so not a big deal.
Okay.
So I think this is not that important part of the picture. And even if you're imagining 50-50, okay, that's just a factor of 2. And so if you're you spend all your compute running AI researchers, you have no compute for experiments, that's just an unforced error.
Yeah.
So how many AI researchers? People have done various estimates of how many AI researchers do you expect at the point when you can first automate things. So you definitely have to have enough researchers to automate everything. But for various reasons, I think we kind of expect that you'll have more researchers than you needed to automate everything. Because at the first point you can start automating everything, you probably have way more labor at that same level of quality. I think inference time compute could make this different. It might be that inference time compute means that at the first time you can automate everything, you can barely automate everything. But I think this is not that likely to be durable, right? So at the first time you can do this, probably you can radically reduce the cost pretty quickly using stuff we were talking earlier about distillation. So overall, my sense is I don't know, I've done some kind of trashy estimates. I'll try to go through one of them. Maybe we have just out of the box, we have the equivalent of 100 million human equivalent laborers. Because we expect that we're training on maybe it's about 1E28, 1E29 flop, which is roughly what we expect in sort of the 2029, 2030 period to be available. And then if you just do that and then you get a sense of how many tokens you'll be able to generate, and then you try to do some rough conversion between tokens and human labor, then okay, maybe it's the case that you have 100 million AI laborers. That's also taking into account things like the AIs do not sleep, they do not get tired, they can work 24/7. And the data center can run 24/7. So maybe you have 100 million workers, but then we're okay, maybe you got some of that with inference compute. So, maybe we drop an order of magnitude because you got some of that on inference compute. And then, okay, maybe you got some of that because of the AI sort of, you got to Alec Radford quality. So to do full automation, I think you have to have near Alec Radford's, famous AI researcher, has, many of the most important capabilities insights, Ilya Sutskever, whatever. To get to this level of quality, maybe you have to spend even more inference compute. I think it's useful to denominate in terms of units of like top research scientists or, top research engineers, because I think that'll make some of the conversions easier. Let's say you have like 1 million Alec Radford equivalents in parallel. Okay, but then there's another factor, which is the AIs can run faster, right? So, for example, they work at night, and that gives them some advantage over human laborers because they can do like serially more experiments, right? So humans, because of the serial time, just get less done in a year because they're, only working maybe a third of the time, or, for like the mortals, maybe a fourth of the time, and then like the some people can push up to like, half of the time potentially. There's some, diminishing returns on focus in hours. And then they can also just run faster because they just, spit out tokens faster. And there's some ways to make this go further. So maybe my overall sense is that it's it's like maybe they're like 5x faster at each given point in time, and then 3x faster due to running at all hours. So that's a 15x speed up. In addition to that, I think you maybe get another 2x speed up because some of the time you can run the AIs. You can run a dumber AI that's much faster for some subtasks, and humans can't do this as easily because it requires context switching, right? So in principle, you could imagine sort of having humans use a dumber AI for some subtasks very quickly and switching back and forth, but you can't like exchange my brain state with the brain state of the weaker AI. Whereas, for example, with transformers, you can just totally feed the context to a weaker AI. You can train the weaker AI to work with the smarter AI. You can even do stuff like shove the activations of the smarter AI into the weaker AI and do all kinds of variable compute scaling things at runtime like this. So maybe that gets you another factor of 2. So now we're up to 30x speed. And to be clear, these speed ups are going to take off. They're going to shave off the number of parallel copies we have. And then I think you maybe get another factor of 2 from like the AIs being better at coordinating than humans. So I talked about like maybe they can like interchange context with weaker AIs. Well, maybe they're also just much better at coordinating across parallel tasks. And let's think about this in terms of like a speed up. So like, they can take a task that, maybe it would be infeasible for humans to parallelize. So humans like basically like sometimes when you do an 8-hour software engineering task, you could in principle have 5 people work on it all in parallel, but you lose a lot on efficiency and maybe get no serial speed up because humans are so bad at coordinating. But maybe the AIs can sort of have all the same context because they can fork off of the same point. So you like start with some AI, you fork off of it. There's a nice Durkesh article on all the structural advantages AIs might have. Goes into this sort of thing. And because you can fork, maybe you get more speed up. Let's say that's another factor of 2. Okay, now we're up to 60x speed.
Right.
Okay, so we had our 1 million AIs at 60x speed. So that's like, let's, make 50,000. Let's go to 50x speed, sorry. And so then we have 20,000 AIs in parallel instances, each running at 50x speed, and all of them are as good as, the top research scientists, the top research engineers. Now, how much of a speed up is this over, like, let's say, OpenAI or whatever? So maybe OpenAI, at the point when they're building this AI, will have somewhere between 2,000 to 5,000 researchers. The number of researchers are growing over time. Okay, so naively, we have 10x more parallel instances, but they're also, 50x faster. And so then there's some like messy conversion between how much additional labor you're putting into what overall speed up you expect, taking into account the fact there's compute bottlenecks and other things. And also the fact that there's like penalties for running in parallel. So like, 9 software engineers cannot make a thing happen that would have taken 9 months in 1 month, the same for the babies, 9 women.
You can't have 9 women have one pregnancy in 1 month. Yeah.
And so I think a thing humans suffer from is parallelization penalties. And so the fact that the AIs run much faster mean in some sense they suffer less from this, right? So there's more parallel copies by a factor of maybe 10 or so. And so they're eating some return on that. But you have also just straight up 50x more speed and also more quality. And the quality pushes into the parallelism as well. And so then I'm like, okay, so maybe we should really think of the OpenAI labor force as being like as good as like, maybe like 5 or 10x fewer people that were better. So it's like maybe it's as though they had like, 200 or 400 Alec Radfords or whatever. I think some people think it's even more extreme than this. And then if it's like, well, they have 200 or 400 Alec Radfords and we have 20,000 Alec Radfords at 50x speed, I think like intuitively it feels like things could get crazy. But the question is just how much does the compute bottleneck? And people disagree a lot on this. We really don't know. No one has run the experiments that we would need to find out how big of a deal this is. We just have like surveys and vibes and whatever.
What experiment would you run?
So a thing you could run is you could try to say, like here would be my favorite. So Google is known for having a large number of different teams. And I think probably at some point, someone messed up the compute allocation to some team, or there was some exogenous shock causing the compute allocation to some team to be lower than it was supposed to be or to be higher than it was supposed to be. And then you could look at the question of when that happened, how much did progress speed up or slow down? And that would give you some sense of what the marginal production function looks like, what the marginal returns to compute look like. And that would give us at least some sense of what's going on. Now, in the AI case, we're sort of operating very far off of the human margin because we have so much more labor. So the situation might be very structurally different. But that would give us some sense. And I think my dream is sort of that like someone goes to, GDM or whatever and scrounges up the data on all the natural experiments they must have been running and sort of like a very economist style analysis on that and figures out what the local returns look like.
Yeah.
That only tells us so much because it's only the returns around the current regime. I think even better than that might be like things like have a small team of researchers who you give way less compute to. So, if Google is really into running experiments, not just giving us data, they could, I pick on Google just because that's the example, but other companies could do this. They could take some of their researchers and split them into 2 groups or, split them into more groups and have some of the researchers get way less compute, get more like the amount of compute we expect our AI researchers to have per instance, and see how much slower they operate. And I think if it's way, way, way slower, that would give us a sense on the regimes. I think this is a trickier thing to understand, partially because there might be adaptation time. So it might be like, okay, you put the humans in this regime with way less compute. Initially, they're way slower, but they sort of learn to work within those limits. And I think the AIs will have lots of time to learn to work within those limits because they're running so much faster. Anyway, so regardless, my sense is that the initial speed up, sort of the instantaneous speed up of your AI researchers will be, ballpark. Maybe it's about like, when I take all these things into account and try to do the math on the production function, maybe I do something like a Cobbs-Douglas production function with some factors, and we try to like have a parallelism penalty that we apply both to the humans and the AIs, and we like normalize the labor force. There's a bunch of messy stuff here. I think that like the inside view, fully like extrapolating from the current frontier econ model, spits out numbers like, depending on exactly how you do the estimate, I think maybe my favorite picks of the constants are like around 50x faster. Now, I think this is probably overestimating the speed. So now that's 50x faster than the current rate of progress. So the current rate of algorithmic progress is like somewhat over half an oom per year. So naively, that would get you some truly ungodly instantaneous rate of 25 ohms per year. Okay, so I think people might be like, okay, come on. The thing you're saying, that's ridiculous. I think I'm like, okay, yeah, the thing I'm saying, it's a bit ridiculous. So maybe we want to discount this view of the instantaneous speed up a lot, right? So rather than having the equivalent of 50 years of progress, or like, 1 year of progress in 1 week, I'm like, okay, maybe that's too crazy. And then I think I end up sort of dividing down to maybe it's more like, 20x rate of progress, maybe even a bit lower than that at the instantaneous speed as sort of my median guess. And again, I think this is like so wild speculation.
Yeah.
We're like extrapolating from a regime that we don't even understand to a wildly different regime.
Yeah.
No one knows. So it could be much faster, it could be much slower, or it can't be that much faster, I guess. But
yeah. Okay. And so you've got this kind of, at the point that you fully automate it, it sounds like it could be blisteringly fast at that moment. But I guess one way of making this sound less crazy is you say it starts out incredibly fast and then starts flattening out quite quickly.
Yeah.
So you only have, 1 week of this level of blistering progress.
Yeah.
I guess the alternative is it could go even faster. You were saying that is also a live possibility. Yeah. Do you want to explain like what evidence would bear on whether we expect it to slow down versus speed up?
Yeah. So another thing on that is I've sort of been doing this instantaneous analysis. And I think people might be like, well, okay, sure, maybe you'd get that if you dropped these in, but it'll be more gradual in the lead up to this. So for one thing, in short timelines, I think we should expect the gap between substantial acceleration but not full automation, and full automation is small in calendar time. And if you're expecting that the substantial automation speeds things up, then it's even smaller in calendar time. And so I think this instantaneous analysis is at least non-crazy. Regardless, so the question of, okay, yeah, does it speed up or does it slow down? So if we had this sort of 10 or 20x progress rate, then we'd be talking like the instantaneous rate is like 5 or 10 ohms in 1 year. Orders of magnitude of effective compute progress. Now, does it speed up or does it slow down? So now this analysis is even trickier. There's a lot more factors in does it speed up or does it slow down. So the basic story is you have your AIs, they do a bunch of algorithmic research, they train a new AI, that new AI is smarter and better and more efficient. That new AI, or some mixture of those attributes, that new AI does even faster algorithmic research, but the returns have also diminished, right? So the returns are diminishing, but also you have smarter AIs, and you can get either super exponential progress, exactly exponential progress, or exactly exponential progress is sort of like it continues at the same rate, right? So the progress was already exponential in effective compute, or you can have decaying progress. So the way that we try to get an estimate for this is we try to have a sense of, okay, we've been dumping in more and more human labor over time into things like computer vision, LLMs, and we can try to get a vague sense of like, okay, when we've been dumping in all those researchers, how much has that accelerated progress? And then we do a bunch of adjustments for the AI case. And then we have, okay, so maybe we have a conversion from like dumping in AI labor to how much effective compute, how much more effective compute that keeps getting you, right? Which we also needed the same sort of analysis to get the initial speed up. And if we have that, then the question is, okay, how much more labor does each effective compute get us, right? So like each 10xing of effective compute sort of gets us more labor. It also gets us more capable labor, and then sort of that can loop back in. And so there's a bunch of math here. And again, I think we have even more uncertainty on this component, plausibly than the previous component. But I think the best estimates indicate that at least initially progress will speed up rather than slow down.
Okay.
Probably. I mean, you can roll disbelief on this or whatever, but I think if you just do the naive analysis, you try to account for the factors, you try to account for the compute bottlenecks, you try to account for parallelism issues, you try to account for all this stuff. It turns out that it's just makes the AIs more capable and smarter fast enough that very roughly on our very trashy models, we expect progress to speed up reasonably quickly.
So if this is right, we're like blowing past human level incredibly quickly into a totally superhuman regime for these, like in terms of just how capable these models are in general. Am I understanding right?
Well, it's kind of complicated.
Okay.
So there's a question of how many orders of magnitude of progress do you get? And there's a question of what is the qualitative, how does that qualitatively affect this? Yeah, how much does it matter, right? So I'm throwing around this effective compute unit, and I think this is the problem of being like a very econ brain unit of analysis. And people are like, okay, come on, how much is an effective compute, an order of magnitude of effective compute even? How much does that matter? Now, we were talking about that earlier in the discussion, like how much is an effective compute, an order of magnitude of effective compute between like DeepSeek v3 and Grok. And we also care about does the qualitative trend continue? What is the right qualitative trend? How superhuman can things even get?
Yeah.
This sort of thing. I think I want to spend a bit more time on one thing about the accelerating progress, which is that I think everyone expects, or you should expect, that the returns, eventually must diminish, right? So another key factor is limits, right? So, progress can only go on for so long, right? You cannot get 100 ohms of progress, because at some point you're like, yes,
the laws of physics bite.
Yeah, the laws of physics bite. And also, more importantly, perhaps, the amount of compute you have bites, right? So, you only had so much compute. I've been talking about all this analysis sort of on a fixed compute base. Here's a naive bear case for efficiency. So imagine that, you got 10 ohms of progress on algorithmic efficiency as of now. That would naively imply that you could train DeepSeek v3. So 10 ohms is a factor of 10 billion. It was trained for $5 million. So that's like, well less than a cent.
Right.
Okay. So, or just less than a cent, or whatever. It's, around, it's certainly
very little.
It's very little, right?
Yeah.
So, it's a bit less than a cent. And so, okay. So come on, are you going to be able to train DeepSeek v3 for less than a cent, right? So that's like, you're doing seconds on an H100, less than seconds on an H100.
Yeah.
I'm like, come on, guys. If you are like, how many parameters can that be? So on that same ballpark, it's like, how many numbers can you even multiply, right?
Yeah.
So it's just like, you can only have touched so many parameters, right? Like we can if you just do all this, I think you should be very skeptical. Now, one thing that's worth noting is I think limits up might be different than limits down. So it might be that you can only make things so much more efficient, but it might be that you can make things scale better, right? So it's like, okay, sure, you can only make it so DeepSeek v3 is, maybe 5 orders of magnitude more efficient, 4 orders of magnitude more efficient, even in the limits, but maybe, I think probably a little more than that, but, somewhere around there. But maybe you can make DeepSeek v3 there's some scaling trend. So like there's a question of like how good would DeepSeek v3 be if we scaled it up by a factor of 5 orders of magnitude. Maybe we can, for DeepSeek v3 level compute, go up 5 orders of magnitude on the DeepSeek v3 scaling law. Does this make sense? This is a bit tricky.
No, yeah. Okay. Maybe explain that like I'm a bit of an idiot.
Okay. So for every model, sort of there's some way to naively scale this up. Both on RL and data and whatever. Now, there's a bit of complexity around this, and it's a bit of a tricky analysis. But we could say, okay, how good would we have been if we took the DeepSeek v3 algorithms and we scaled them up 5 orders of magnitude and like sort of adapted to that amount of compute and didn't mess up that training run.
Yeah.
And so it might be the case that it's much easier to replicate what we would have been able to do with 5 orders of magnitude more compute than DeepSeek v3. Than to
make it much more efficient.
Make it 5 orders of magnitude more efficient. It's a bit tricky to do anchoring because a lot of the limits I'm defining in different ways, but minimally I think 10 orders of magnitude up on the DeepSeek v3 efficiency, as in you're doing with DeepSeek v3 training compute as well as if you were doing 10 orders of magnitude more compute on those same algorithms seems very plausible to me.
Okay, what does that imply?
Yeah, so I think there's a bunch of ways of doing the analysis. I'll try to do a quick version of the analysis that's very, it's very quick and dirty, but gets us something. So we trained our human level AIs, or our AIs that are, at the level of broadly at the level of top human research scientists, let's say in 2029 or 2030. So maybe we had maybe we did that on ballpark, the training run was maybe around 1E28 flop, okay? And we produce something at the level of humans. So we have some very trashy estimates of human brain lifetime compute, like how much compute the human brain is using in a lifetime. And we think it's as in if you had the algorithms of the human brain and you were able to do that, how long would it take to train a human who's as good as, the best human scientists? And our sense is it's around 1E24. So that's 4 orders of magnitude of efficiency right there, right? Because we trained something that was competitive with humans for more compute than humans. So 4 orders of magnitude on that. Maybe it's a bit less, but ballpark. Make sense?
No, not completely. Yeah.
Okay.
Could just What do you mean? It's 4 orders of magnitude of what exactly?
Yeah. So we had we were able to train something that's as good as a human.
Yeah.
But it required us to use
4 times as much.
4 orders of magnitude more compute.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. 4 orders of magnitude. Yeah.
And so you might think, well, okay, at the very least, we can sort of get to the point where we can train a human for 1E24 flop, or a human level model, and then we have 4 orders of magnitude of room above that to expand.
We have 4 orders of magnitude more to expand.
As in, imagine that we advance the algorithm so we can now train a human for 1E24 flop. Now we have an additional 4 ooms of scaling available to us.
That was available. Okay.
Yeah.
Because originally we were using it because it was so inefficient, the training.
Yeah,
the
that's right.
was about, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And an important thing here is in shorter timelines, we must be imagining we have more efficient algorithms. Whereas in longer timelines where more compute is acquired, presumably we have less efficient algorithms. There's some interesting dynamic here.
Why is that?
As in, so imagine that we produce full automation of an AI company in 2028, 2029, 2030. Then we must be operating in this sort of around 1E28, 1E30 training runs.
Okay.
On the other hand, imagine we're doing it in 2040 or 2045. Plausibly, we could be having quite a few more orders of magnitude of compute. I haven't done the math, but maybe at least could be 4 more orders of magnitude, or I think 2050 at least, maybe you could get 4 more orders of magnitude of compute by you've scaled the fabs, you made them cheaper, you have new techniques, maybe you're using optical computing and more speculative approaches. And so we if you're training sort of the human level AIs for 1E36 flop, then you have way more headroom.
I see.
And
so we know that we can achieve the level of efficiency that the human brain has, and if it was taking 12 orders of magnitude more compute to reach the equivalent performance as a human, well, then you have an enormous amount of potential algorithmic efficiency gain
in the limit. In the
limit. Okay. Yeah.
Anyway, so I think a reasonable objection here is, okay, come on, but we don't know what the human brain is doing. Can we even produce that level of compute? Also, isn't it the case that evolution did a huge amount of optimization? Maybe that required a bunch of compute. And so even if, in principle, you could have the human algorithm, which is like the human genome, finding the human genome, that itself would take a huge amount of research compute because we have to run simulations equivalent to what evolution would run. So this is some skepticism.
Yeah.
I'm basically going to put this aside and not address it and just be I'm skeptical. But I think it's going to be, somewhere in between this picture. But I don't think that's a huge discount. And there's another thing, which is that we don't think that humans are at the limit of efficiency. So there's many reasons why humans are inefficient. So they have physical brains under a bunch of constraints. So they can only do local training algorithms for structural reasons about like propagation of information backward. So they can't, like human brains basically can't do backprop very directly, and they can only do more local learning algorithms. And so our current best local learning algorithms are much, much worse than SGD. Of course, evolution, had more time optimizing these local learning algorithms. So maybe that's a big factor. Maybe that's even like 2 orders of magnitude. And then maybe there's a bunch of other factors. So another thing is that within humans, performance on the task of AI R&D varies wildly, right? So there's a huge variation between the median human and the best human on what I would say like on like ability to do this. Some of that's training, some of that's genetics, some of that's like heritability from things other than, upbringing from things other than direct training, like training on other tasks. So maybe that gives us another bunch of headroom, right? So you can imagine like making 300 IQ humans, not by having much bigger brains, but just by having more efficient brains with like more of the mutations removed, possibly more than that. And so that gets you some more. And I mean, there's a long list of considerations like this. Things like, oh, maybe the AIs are able to like sync mind states more effectively, which gives them more coordination. There's things like maybe they can generate much better training data. I'm going to miss some of these. But anyway, sure. I think when we add all these up, my guess is sort of like a median of like 9 ohms up. We talked about the distinction between up and down. That's also going to apply on humans, right? So maybe you can't train a human for 9 ohms less flop, right? So you can't train a human for 1E15 flop, which would be like a second on an H100. But maybe you can train something that's like 9 ohms better than a human with human level compute.
I see. Okay, that might be the most technical or like challenging to follow half hour of the show that we've ever had. I was like very, very happy to let you go so people can get a sense of like just how many moving pieces there are here. And I guess also like how much thought has gone into this. It sounds like there are quite a lot of people trying to forecast this time and trying to sketch out the different plausible trajectories and the different factors that weigh on it. Is it possible to kind of bring it back to something that like someone with like less technical understanding can grasp? I mean, is the bottom line, people thought about it a lot. It's like it's quite hazy. There's a lot of factors at play. It's possible that at like peak AI R&D things could be moving very fast, and it is plausible that it could even speed up. It could like speed up as the AIs get better. It's also possible it could slow down. We should just be open to all of these different options.
Yeah, so I think I would have said surprisingly little time has been spent thinking about this actually. So I think as far as I can tell, like maybe around like 4 full-time equivalent years have been spent very directly on trying to build these models to forecast takeoff and applying those models to forecast timelines. Ballpark, maybe even less than this. And now there's a bunch more work that Epoch has done on sort of trends and other analysis that I'm pulling in, but on the very direct sort of like this type of analysis I'm talking about, sort of these takeoff dynamic analysis, I think it's, maybe it's more like, maybe at this point it's more like 8 equivalent years. I think I forgot, I was not pricing in a few Epoch papers. Okay. But I don't know, maybe the Epoch people are going to call me out for underrating their hard work. But they've done a bunch of the background work of like the statistics I'm pulling in and a lot of the trends I'm pulling in. But I think there hasn't been that much work on sort of like the analysis here. So I'm like, come on, 8-person years. Like, this is maybe like the most important or like one of the most important questions. Yeah. I don't expect us to get that much signal on it, but it does have a huge effect, and it is a very big disagreement. I think a lot of people are sort of expecting that, progress peters out around human level, or, it just is relatively slow, or it's mostly bottlenecked on compute. And I think the question of whether this is true or not makes a huge difference. One argument also I didn't mention there, which sort of I just brought up, was like, I was sort of imagining we just are just like flying through this human regime with no important discontinuity or kink around human level. But it could in principle be that, you sort of were able to get to the human level via sort of piggybacking or fast following on human behavior. My kind of guess is this isn't that big of a factor, and it's just like a one-time cost that's not that big. But that's I think we shouldn't get too much into that. Anyway, we had how fast is the initial speed up? Does it speed up or does it slow down? And we had what are the limits? And the limits sort of affect like eventually it must slow down, right? So we have this model in which it maybe even if it initially is speeding up and it's like continuing to speed up and it's following this like sort of hyperbolic trajectory where it's, going to infinity in finite time. Okay, eventually that must end as you're starting to near the limits. We don't know when it starts to slow down, right? It's going to slow down at some point. But I think the all considered model is like things might be very fast. It could happen quite quickly. A lot of, I think, the estimates imply, like my median is like maybe we're hitting about 5 or 6 orders of magnitude of progress in a year of algorithmic progress.
And it's a bit hard to know exactly what qualitative impact that will have on how
For sure.
how smart the models will actually feel to us.
Yeah, for sure. So I think that is another big source of uncertainty. Is like I think I've been doing this sort of very econ brain analysis where I put everything in these effective compute units, and I'm doing a bunch of like quick conversions back and forth to labor supply to get a bunch of things.
Yeah.
And so there's a bunch of different ways of sort of visualizing this progress. I should also say like there's a few factors I'm neglecting, like you're scaling up compute during this period, and like a bunch of other minor considerations. These are all priced into my 5 or 6 ooms of progress in a year, but I don't think we should get too much into that. Regardless, okay, like I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I'm curious if you're. So I have this sort of intuitive. I mean, to me, intuitive model of like initial rate, speed up, slow down, limits, and then limits affect like when even if it's initially speeding up, when it starts slowing down again.
Yeah.
Does this model sort of make sense to you? Or?
Yes. Yeah. I think that makes sense. Those are kind of the 3 big stylistic factors that you're playing around.
Yeah. And then there's a bunch of like tricky details about like, okay, well, suppose the limit is this many ooms away, and the sort of the factor of like, is it speeding up or is it slowing down? How does that change over time? You might think like, okay, it's initially speeding up and the time at which that stops is like very close to the end of the limits, or it could be that it's sort of more continuous across the limits, and this will have a big effect on how many orders of magnitude you get. But regardless, I think, okay, that's the sort of intuitive model. I think people should like kind of play with this. I think like playing with this sort of model is interesting. I think it's pretty clear that sort of this is both a simplified model and also has an insane number of moving parts that we have very little data to estimate. We're sort of fitting this model in a massively extrapolated regime from trashy data. So, what can we do? And including data as trashy as guessing how much more efficient you can be than the human brain. Right. So as you were saying, we're very, very uncertain. And we have huge error bars on like, I guess my view is like, you're going to get some initial speed up, and you're also going to be able to pile in more compute. And so, maybe the 25th percentile is like, you get like somewhat faster than previous years of progress. Maybe you get like, or I think the 25th percentile is possibly just barely faster than pre-existing progress. And I think that like 80th or 75th percentile might be like completely insane.
So this is the question. At the point that we are able to automate things, how much does it actually speed up what the company was doing? And you're saying the 25th percentile of this is like maybe it's kind of just at roughly the same rate as it was before.
Yeah.
And but the 75th percentile, which is not even an extreme outcome, is that it's radically speeding up the
at least quickly,
rate.
right? It might be that the initial speed up is not that high, but the speed up increases over time and diminishes relatively slowly. And also, I've been talking about this 1-year time scale, but I think on a lot of the modeling, most of the progress might happen in the first 6 months. Because it's sort of, you've already started to hit this diminishing returns regime kind of quickly. So it's
like the faster you go, the sooner you start hitting limits.
Yeah, that's right. And it could go pretty different ways. Anyway, but I've been saying 6 ooms of progress. Like, what does that even mean? What does this look like?
Oom is order of magnitude for anyone who didn't pick that up but is still with us.
I'm so sorry. I love What a good term. It's one of my favorite. It's It's just got the.
It's an onomatopoeia.
Yeah. It's great. Anyway. So 6 ooms, how much is that? So it's roughly 2 GPTs, as in like, I think like there was broadly like an oom between GPT-2 and GPT-3 in terms of like, maybe it was, roughly 10x algorithmic progress and around, 100x compute, very roughly speaking, maybe a bit less than this, and something broadly similar between GPT-3 and GPT-4. So I think the naive qualitative model we can do is we can be like, well, how big was the GPT-3 to GPT-4 gap? And then we can be like, well, we have 2 of those gaps, 2 more GPTs. And then I'm like, okay, what does that mean? So I think the 2 GPTs analysis sort of makes me feel more reassured. So I'm like, 2 GPTs, is that even that bad? I mean, come on. I think another framing is how many years of AI progress is this? So I think 6 ooms is like 5 years of AI progress, very roughly speaking, maybe 4. So it's like, it's like going from 2020, we had gotten GPT-2 XL to now. So it's like, it's the gap between...
but I guess it's hard to know intuitively what that means because GPT-2 was like pretty useless for anything.
Yeah, or GPT-3 was pretty close by. Yeah, so that's pretty useless. So I think, definitely like, I think perhaps the thing that we even have less grounding on is how much this means. Like how much does progress above the human range mean? Note that we're starting at the point we're starting this, the AIs are matching the best human professionals. Maybe they're not quite as efficient, not quite as smart, but via like various tricks and whatever, they can basically match human professionals. Now, how much further do you go? So there's the GPTs, there's this. I think there's some, another notion is sort of trying to convert from the GPTs to like some like IQ or some like notion of that. I think people have wildly different intuitions here, but like if we imagine that we were sort of starting at our like 150 IQ AIs because they were able to automate everything.
Yeah.
Again, IQ kind of a trashy unit.
Yeah.
Maybe
feels like it wasn't designed for this purpose to
oh
extend
no,
yeah.
I'm like nothing was designed. Like we're also, I think we're abusing the shit out of these econ models also. I've been doing all this like econ style analysis on econ models that I don't know if they're designed, they definitely weren't designed with this regime in mind.
Whether they can be stretched to fit.
And growth economics, which is sort of the field that we're pulling from, is just not that good of a field. Sorry, no offense to the growth economists out there, but there's just not that many people working on it.
Yeah.
And I think it's we have a lot of uncertainty over a lot of things here. Anyway, so there's the two GPTs. How many IQ points is that? This intuition makes me think, maybe a GPT is a bit over 50 IQ points or something. And so we go from 150 to 250. And also we have many more parallel copies and they can run faster. So I think these are some intuitions. I think another intuition is how much better are they in terms of human professionals? So here's a trend that I think is good to track. So if you look at like programming competitions, we've been seeing progress in terms of ranking on those programming competitions over 2024. So at the start, maybe the AIs were like, I think like 20th percentile roughly, and then they were at 50th percentile, and then they were at O1 was like 75th, O1 preview was like a bit over 90th percentile, and then I think O3 was like 99.8th percentile or something. So there's some relationship between orders of magnitude of compute or algorithmic progress and what like rank ordering you have among human professionals. So at the point when we're starting this crazy stuff, maybe the AIs are like broadly like they're like sort of like 100th or 10th best human professional rank ordering. And then we have these sort of 6 orders of magnitude of progress. I think that there's like some conversion we could try to have between orders of magnitude and ranking, where it's like every order of magnitude maybe means that you're like 10x better on this ranking. So instead of being like, the 1,000th best, you're the 100th best.
Yeah.
My guess is it's a bit over, like an of effective compute is somewhat more than an of this sort of rank ordering.
Yeah.
I think no one has done this analysis very carefully. Someone should do it. Suppose that it's like a little over an then maybe it's like, okay, with our 6 we get 8 of rank ordering. Okay, and so
pretty soon you're below 1, right?
What?
Pretty soon
you're below 1. So now we're extrapolating this thing, and so one way to put this is sort of quickly get to just human parity, and then maybe we have like another, I don't know, a bit more than 6 left still, or like say best human, like the literal best human parity, and then we have another 6 of progress, and so then we can be like, well, it's as though it's as big of a gap as going from the millionth best human at a thing, because million is 6 to the best human at a thing again. So it's like we took the best human and we did the equivalent of going from the millionth best to the best.
Yeah.
And like that's another qualitative intuition. I don't know how much that tells you, but it's like there's some extrapolation there you can do. This is brazenly ripped from Daniel Cucatello's way of thinking about the
Yeah.
Now, we also have uncertainty on this point. So I think if it's more like each is 2 then it's like, well, maybe it's more like you're like over a billion X better than the best human professionals.
You've gone from the billionth best at something, or you've gone from the billionth best to the very best, and then you've made that leap again.
Yeah, that's right. Which is like a kind
of like quite a large gap.
Yeah,
probably.
so I'm like, billionth best, I think. So importantly, like a thing that you can't understand the billionth best in the human range because it's like I think it's like doesn't make sense to generalize out of a career. Like I think being like, yes, who's the billionth best person at software engineering?
Yeah.
I'm like, okay, come on, guys. Like this isn't this is a
silly question.
This is a silly question. And I think the millionth best person at software engineering is now like at least somewhat meaningful, right? That's like, we can start working with that. And more niche human professionals, it's like, or human professions, it's less meaningful. So I think like, we have this like kind of insane gap from that. Another intuition I like is sort of thinking about like how big is the labor supply? So a lot of the like econ analysis I was doing earlier about like, does progress speed up or slow down? An important question was how much does each like order of magnitude of effective compute get you in terms of like more cognitive juice to throw at problems, in terms of like how much can you sort of feed into the labor part of the production function. I think that if we convert into parallel workers, so one way to do it is we can just be like, okay, how good is an order of magnitude of compute relative to how many orders of magnitude of parallel workers is that equivalent to? So my understanding is that our best available estimates are like every order of magnitude of effective compute is like 2 orders of magnitude of parallel workers.
And this is because having lots of people work in parallel is actually quite inefficient. So
It's partially because it's inefficient, and it's partially because you get more the AIs are faster, more capable, and you get more parallel copies. So when you scale up effective compute, at least in the current paradigm, you have more efficient AIs that are smarter, potentially. And so you can basically be scaling all these factors in parallel, and you can be scaling whichever factor is most effective.
I see. So you get to choose, do you want to have, you get to allocate your compute budget between having more of them and having smarter ones.
Yeah, and you can sort of gear
in the most efficient combination.
Yeah, and you can sort of gear your training runs to be like, okay, are we training like a bigger model, or are we training like a smaller model? And there's some trade-offs between all these things that's kind of complicated, and there's ways to trade off inference compute and training compute as well. But all considered, like I'm going to do denomination and parallel copy. So we started with sort of this like 20,000 geniuses running at 50x speed. And then, okay, we had 6 orders of magnitude, but we're actually doubling that. So we have 12 orders of magnitude. That's a trillion. So now we're going to 20 quadrillion running at 50x speed. So now I think this is like perhaps a bit misleading because an important component is the parallelism bottlenecks. But if you were used to thinking in terms of human organizations, then I think you should think of like 20 quadrillion humans running at 50x speed is right. And like the amount of stepping on toes is like sort of analogous to
Quite
that.
Substantial, yeah.
And then in practice, maybe it'll be more like the thing I actually more expect. Maybe it's qualitatively closer to like 1 billion or 2 billion humans that are way smarter than humans. So like 250 IQ humans running at like 100x speed. That's like, okay, probably my numbers are a bit sloppy, but I think that's more like the intuition I expect. And then like, or you could do the same in terms of the professionals. So it could be like, it's as though we have like, I think you have to be careful not to overcount, right? So like part of the mechanism via which they're much better at human professions is having more of them. And so like all these things are going to fudge across. But like maybe it's as though we have this like, you go from millionth best human to best human and then million above that. We sort of like, do the same extrapolation. Maybe it's as though we have like, millions of them at least running at 100x speed, which is like, I think like, okay, this is like fucking insane, right? Like, I think this is like, for example, very quickly, the AIs will do more cognitive progress on problems than has been applied in human history by huge margins. And like, very naively, like they're running at 100x speed. So it's like, well, if there's something that you could have done purely in the domain of cognition, like purely without access to the world, that would have taken humans 10 years, and it would have taken like a team of 100 humans 10 years, I'm like, okay, boom, happens in 1/10 of a year with just a tiny fraction of the labor supply.
Yeah.
And so I think we should like start being like, what kinds of crazy technologies will be spit out of this process? So there's a bunch of things that I think could in principle be accelerated massively that we haven't even tried that hard at. Effort has been spent on like atomically precise manufacturing. Not that much effort has been spent on like nanobots, nanosystems, whatever. I think Drexler, who is like, originally thought about this, thought it was going to be very little labor, thought that it might be very easy for humans to do, but very little effort has been applied. And so it seems very plausible that you come out of this regime very quickly with like, atomically precise manufacturing that allows for like massively increasing the compute supply and all kinds of other crazy things. That's like one example. Like I think like emulated minds, a ton of other things could happen pretty quickly.
Yeah. I guess to wrap up, it would be good to do a bit of discussion of what you think are the highest priority things for the sorts of people who listen to this show to be working on, given your kind of predictions or your enormous distribution of predictions about different ways that things could run. What are, on the technical side, what are some of the things that stand out to you as particularly neglected and useful?
Yeah, I think more people should do control work relative to what's going on. My colleague Buck is probably going to talk more about what that would look like, so maybe I won't go into too much detail there. I think that's now a lot less neglected than it was, but still seems good to have more people working on. I think more people should spend their time thinking about and working on how would you train like I guess like AIs that are like wise and are able to make decisions that are better than the decisions we would make, and basically how you would get sort of in a point where you have ruled out the models like plotting against you, how would you make them be the AIs that you're happy to hand over? I think this is like a much more conceptually thorny area, and I think I'm planning on spending more time thinking about what research projects should be spun out of that. I think there's a decent amount of work on like what I would call model internals that people could work on. So things like maybe this is falling somewhat under control, but things like probing to make it so that we can detect if the models are taking misaligned actions. How would we do that? How would we know if it worked? This sort of thing. There's some work on sort of decoding uninterpretable reasoning. So things like, suppose models learn to reason stenographically in their chain of thought. Suppose models.
So this is that they're scheming against you, but you can't tell. It's kind of encoded.
Yeah, steganographic is like they're sort of using different symbols and you don't understand what's going on. Or maybe it looks like gibberish to you. Maybe it looks like one thing, but it actually is another thing. Or maybe it's like they're doing a lot of like latent reasoning. We talked earlier about maybe models doing a lot of reasoning in like a latent way rather than in, natural language, and being able to decode that reasoning in some way and trying to figure out some methods for training decoders on that work somewhat and give us some sense of what the AI is actually thinking, I think could be pretty helpful. In addition to this, I think a bunch of different work on demonstrating AIs are very capable now. Like I talked some about how I think there's overhang in the level of capability that has been demonstrated. And I think demonstrating that current systems are capable and future systems are very capable seems probably somewhat good at the margin, because I'm worried about situations where the world is not very prepared for what's going on. So things like, demonstrating high levels of autonomous cyber capability, which I think it's at a sweet spot of both being like, directly relevant to a lot of threat models people are already considering, and also is like not that far from the scenarios that we're worried about, which do involve a lot of like autonomous cyber activity, and that is like actually a key part of the threat model. So it maybe bridges this divide in a nice way, and especially focusing on like what is the demo that is the best demo that we will ever be able to achieve in this realm. Another big area that people should work on is what I would call like model organisms, which is trying to produce empirical examples of a misaligned model, either to study how likely this is to arise and present evidence about that. So things like, well, does misalignment arise in XYZ circumstance? Does reward hacking emerge, and how does it generalize? Things like, the alignment faking paper and various continuations of that. And I think part of the hope here is gathering evidence. Part of the hope here is just having something to iterate on with techniques. So even model organisms which aren't very convincing to the world, or maybe don't produce any evidence about misalignment one way or another, if they're analogous enough that we can experiment on them, that could be potentially very useful.
Because you can try to develop countermeasures that work in the model organism case that then hopefully will transfer.
Yeah, I mean, I think a key difficulty with like alignment overall is like normally we solve problems with empirical iteration, and to the extent that a lot of our alignment failures sort of make our tests deceptive, then if we can build some way to get around that in advance, or just be ready to build it in the last minute and then do a bunch of iteration in those kinds of cases, I think that could be pretty helpful.
Yeah. Okay, so that was what seems most promising on the technical side. Are there things that stand out on governance or just other angles?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a variety of different room for like non-technical interventions that seem pretty good. I think it's hard for me to have very strong views on these things because I don't spend that long thinking about it. I think there's a bunch of work. So we've sort of gone through a lot of conceptual points here, and I think there's work. There's room for people working on just like figuring out all these details, trying to have a better understanding of takeoff dynamics, trying to have a better understanding of different considerations other than misalignment that might come up. Things like, how worried should we be about human power grabs? How worried should we be about, other issues? And so I think there's some of that. I think there's a decent amount of work on just like, acting as an intermediary between sort of like the very in the weeds technical AI safety and like the world of policy, and trying to like translate that to some extent. There's a bunch of like specific regulation that could potentially be good. Like I think making the like EU code of practice be better seems good, and like the EU AI office is hiring, so you could work on that. I think like there's like maybe other strategies for regulation that could actually be good. I think there's some stuff related to like making coordination more likely or assisting with coordination that could be pretty helpful. Things like improving the compute governance regime so that the US and China can verify various statements made about the current training process. I don't have a strong view on how promising that is, but I think surprisingly few people are working on that, and that's surprisingly uncoordinated. So maybe someone should get on that, because it could potentially be a pretty big deal.
Yeah.
In addition to that, I think just like having a lot of people in positions where they're sort of, just trying to provide technical expertise, trying to be ready to go, building skills, or like, they're currently building skills, they're currently sort of getting ready to have, more direct impact, and will later, as stuff gets crazier, be ready to do something then.
Yeah.
No, another one is just generic defense. So we talked earlier about AI takeover scenarios. A bunch of the AI takeover scenarios, I was saying, involve like, for example, bioweapons. And so just generically improving robustness to bioweapons seems like it helps some. I think it's kind of complicated the extent to which it helps, but I think it helps some. Similar for like making the world more robust to like, AI is hacking stuff. I think that helps some. I think it's probably less leverage than other things, but I think interventions that steer more resources to those things, I think they seem good from a wide variety of perspectives and under, potentially different assumptions about misalignment. Like I think those things maybe make a lot of sense even with no misalignment risks at all, for example.
Yeah, I guess because misuse is also an issue.
Yeah. And in addition to that, there's a bunch of different work on security that could be good. So some of the threat models I was discussing involve various like outcomes like, the model exfiltrating itself. They involve the model sort of like being internally deployed in a rogue way where it's sort of, bypassing your security and potentially like using a bunch of compute it's not supposed to. I think pushing back the time at which these things happen via security mechanisms seems good. I think that also security to prevent, human actors from stealing the model could potentially increase the probability that there is delay and increase the probability of like less racing, more caution.
Yeah. And what are the priorities for your research over the next couple of months?
So right now I'm doing a decent amount of like sort of planning and conceptual work. And then the plan for that is to then spin off a bunch of projects. So I'm thinking through questions like, okay, what should you do in the sort of scenario where one more irresponsible AI company is 3 months in the lead, there's very low political will, and trying to like say, okay, what's like the full list of like potential alignment measures that might be promising? What is the like route you should take? How should people prioritize? And then trying to maybe make both concrete recommendations and also just figure out things at the margin. Basically like with the aim being that it's just, I don't know, it just seems like I think Redwood has had reasonable luck just trying to make overall plans and then spinning off some insights from this. So I think control came out of this. I think that I've had some updates based on thinking this through more. That's one thing. And then I'm working on some sort of demonstrations of we're trying to look into how big of a deal reward hacking is right now. So just recently, we've sort of seen RL like work when it wasn't really doing as much before and wasn't, being scaled as far. And so one natural question is, how much reward hacking are we getting? How egregious might that be? In what situations is it more or less egregious? There's been some prior work on this, but I think now that, this is like really going quite far, we might expect that we potentially see very egregious reward hacking, and we might see threat models that are just driven purely by reward hacking all the way to very egregious outcomes, like in principle doing things like massively diluting humans or potentially trying to like seize control of assets could potentially be generalized from reward hacking. There's also stories via which reward hacking leads to like very pernicious misalignment because, you started with an AI that was disobeying your instructions and that sort of crystallized in some way that involves the AI conspiring against you, even if it's, not as directly for something that we potentially have as much control over as like the oversight signal.
All right. Well, I guess you and your colleagues write quite a lot on the alignment forum, and I guess you have a Substack. What's the address for that?
The Substack?
Yeah. Okay.
It might be
Redwood. If people Google Redwood Research Substack, they will very quickly find it.
I think it might be redwoodresearch.substack.org. Probably com. Yeah, but our Substack does not have a short URL, I'm afraid.
Yeah. So if you want to kind of pull on some of the threads of the things you've talked about here, there's a pretty high chance that there's some article or blog post out there that you or a colleague have written that could elaborate a bit more.
For sure.
I guess a huge to-do list that you laid out there. If there's people in the audience who are able to help out with that, then I guess time is short. We could use all hands on deck to help push forward all these agendas and hopefully make things go better.
For sure.
My guest today has been Ryan Greenblatt. Thanks so much for coming on the 80,000 Hours podcast, Ryan.
Thanks for having me.